Hey gamers, how's it poppin'? Xenoblade X Definitive Edition has been out for well over a month now, and I think enough people have gotten to and finished the epilogue where it's worth finally making a full lore breakdown of the entire thing. This and the upcoming weekly videos discussing party members, the first one about Neil Nail will premiere a week after this video goes public, are probably going to be my best performing videos for a very long time, so I am going to ask you do the usual YouTube things of liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing the video with others here, because I feel like my channel growth has been very stagnant for the past couple years, and I'd kind of like to change that. My initial goal was to try and hit 50,000 subscribers this year. I don't know how possible that is, but I'd love to at least hit 40,000, and I would be appreciative of any little piece of effort to help me get there. I don't usually mention it, but I will also say here that Patreon subscribers and YouTube members do get most non-time sensitive content an entire week early and ad-free, so if you would like to watch the Neil Nail video immediately after this one releases, you could do that through one of those methods too. Obviously, this will contain spoilers for both the old and new story chapters for X, but I will also be talking about a lot of revelations that only show up in things like normal missions, affinity missions, and party members' heart-to-hearts, so I would recommend seeing as much as X has to offer before you watch this. It's also me, I am the big Xeno Connections guy, so I will be spoiling every other Xenoblade game in this as well. You have been warned. I think a lot of people who'd be tuning into this video are here for my takes and my analysis of potential connections anyway, so I think this was kind of expected. While I am going to go through the events of the epilogue in the order they happen as we play through it, I will sometimes be referring to later scenes when I discuss earlier ones, so it's not safe to say only play through Act 1 of Chapter 13 and only then watch the Act 1 portion of this video. I will be referring to things from the very ending when I'm talking about some earlier scenes. I know this intro is already very long, but I have like 3 more disclaimers before we can actually start talking about things. The first is that this is primarily a lore discussion and explanation and not a review, but I will be giving my thoughts about certain parts of the epilogue as I talk about them. There's no general community consensus on the quality of the epilogue yet, and that generally seems to be because there are 2 big camps, one that thinks it's one of the best things in the series, and one that thinks it's one of the worst things in the series and borderline ruins X for them, where I am one of the few people who is actually kind of in the middle of those two. There are a lot of things that I was very disappointed by and just actively disliked, and then also a lot of things that I thought were cool or just genuinely a pleasant surprise, so whenever I think I have a particularly interesting take on something, I'll also bring that up. Then there's the fact that if you watched a lot of my analysis of the trailers of XDE, you'll find that a lot of my epilogue predictions ended up coming true. And I'm just going to directly outright say it here. I know the comments where people go back to my old videos when I get a prediction right and say, how did he know? He must have insider information. What's Takahashi sending him? I know those are probably mostly jokes, but just to be safe, I'm going to say it here. No, I do not have any insider information from Monolith Soft regarding new or upcoming Xenoblade games. I just get predictions very right sometimes, and I'm proud of myself for being able to do that, even though I don't necessarily think XDE's execution of my predictions was as good as I was hoping it would be. While yes, I was sponsored by Nintendo of America to stream the beginning of the game when it launched, and I was provided a free copy to do so, that was not a review copy. I did not get the game early. I was given a code at midnight on launch day, so I only got to download it the same time anyone else with a North American eShop account did. On top of that, I did also just buy a physical copy of the game for myself to put on my shelf, because I wanted to have one of those. This is something I've actually done with every single Xenoblade game since the original X, where I will get a copy, either physical from a store or digital pre-order, to ensure I can play it on launch day, and then also order another copy so I can have something for my shelf. For every game besides XDE, that was the special edition, but in this case, it was just a physical copy, period. From the moment it was announced, I was always planning on buying 2 copies of the game. Nintendo just happened to provide one of them for me this time. What I'm trying to say with this is, yes, I got a lot of things correct, but I also got a lot of things wrong. My track record is still way below 50-50. Just looking at my last analysis video, you'll hear me say things like, we're probably going to learn about the ancient giant race that lived on Mira, and there's almost no way we're leaving Mira in XDE. That'll be an X2 thing. So, yeah. Would I have preferred for the second thing to happen and not what we got? Probably, but also it didn't happen and I said it would. So take that and the fact that I have a lot of videos where I am just speculating at things and throwing a lot of things at the wall. you should probably view me more as a broken clock who thinks about Xeno much more than I probably should, than a prophet, if that makes any sense. And then lastly, we arrive at the Cosmos-shaped elephant in the room. Zach Scott, I know you're not watching this, but don't even think about it. There are a lot of things in this epilogue that are more or less wholesale a concept from Xenosaga that works exactly the same way it did in those games. And I am the resident Xenosaga agenda guy, so how am I going to handle this? Well, after Future Redeemed, my entire Xenosaga is canon to the universe of the numbered games thing was always predicated on the idea that there's going to be a remaster of the Xenosaga trilogy for modern platforms that includes not just the changed things from the DS version of Xenosagas 1 and 2, but also a few minor dialogue changes and pieces of additional lore explanation that would clear up any of the potential snags or contradictions that prevent Saga and Numbered Blade from connecting in that way. That obviously hasn't happened yet, and my prediction post-Future Redeemed that would be the very next Xeno thing was clearly wrong, but also XDE doesn't contradict any possibility of that being true. Explicitly confirms that all X-related stuff besides maybe the very ending of Chapter 13 takes place in a different universe than the Numbered Trilogy, so none of the X things would even get in the way of Saga, and then also explains how the multiverse works in far greater detail than anything in the Xeno series besides the Xenosaga 3 Perfect Guide stuff, while also describing the structure of things almost exactly how that guide did back in 2006, so the funny thing about this all is, for the scope of this video at least, it literally does not matter whether or not Xenosaga is canon the way I say it is, because the relevant lore is basically identical either way. In the interest of accessibility, I don't want to actually spoil the plot of the Xenosaga games in this video, and talking about them that much would also bloat this more than it needs to be, so I'm going to be talking about things from the perspective of direct analogs or equivalents to things from Saga, or certain details being identical to how they are in Saga, and not going, oh, here's how this plot element in Saga changed how I think about this specific thing from XDE, or here's how this character in Saga is going to be relevant in X2, because there are much more important Saga-related subjects to discuss right now. XDE does set up the possibility of the Samarians still being out there and being a major player in the future of the series, and that is a concept original to Xenoblade X specifically, though it obviously has its roots in stuff from Gears and Saga like everything in the Blade games. But besides that one plot thread, I think it's very, very hard to argue against the fact that the next Xenoblade games are going to, at the very least, be very heavy retoolings and reuses of concepts from the Xenosaga games, even if they don't directly bring them into canon in any way. And I think it is just way more productive in the present day to explain the Xenosaga stuff in Xenoblade terms, and then tell you exactly what the confusing things in the epilogue meant and what that means for X, as opposed to just taking every single long exposition scene and going, this Xeno game is made out of things from other Xeno games, because that is true for every game except Gears. Finally, though, we reach the beginning of Chapter 13, Act 1, which opens immediately with dematerialization events showing up. And in this conversation, I think we could talk about one of the most contentious aspects of the epilogue, and that is the fact that, canonically, it seems to take place not too long after the end of Chapter 12, which I think is one of the biggest issues. Like, the end of Chapter 12 is very much, we've finally settled into life on Mira and we're gonna be okay, no matter how long we're stuck here, and then, like, 2 weeks later, big things start happening and, okay, I guess we're leaving Mira now. It's a little hard to notice, but there are a few time skips during the epilogue, and the entire thing does seem to take place over at least a couple months, but there is not a major time skip in between 12 and the beginning of 13, which I think is a large mistake. 13 can be done right after finishing 12, and I think it would have honestly been better if it required, like, you to be level 70 and have explored a substantial part of Mira before you can start it, so it actually feels like you've done stuff after discovering the Lifehold core. Maybe even it could start with the title card saying 6 months or a year after the recovery of the core or something like that. Conceptually, it is cool that this is Chapter 13 and not a separate campaign, but I think it's actually hurt by being that, because it is paced so much differently from the rest of the story. Like, most of X's main story is basically nothing happens until you get to the last 4 chapters, where things do pick up and start progressing at a pretty reasonable pace, and then you hit the epilogue and all of a sudden, literally everything happens because we had to condense all of the remaining plot threads we had for the original X into this epilogue, so we could get to wherever we want to be for the next game that has to do with X stuff. I definitely disagree with the notion that the epilogue was just made up completely for Definitive Edition and wasn't anything that had to do with the original vision, you could pretty clearly see foreshadowing for all the stuff that happens here in the base game. Like, Frontier Nav 2 being an interstellar thing, and even Elma having post-game affinity missions that talk about probably leaving Mira one day. Lynn's comments about trying to find Earth, or the idea that other Ark ships might have made it out. All of that is still there. I think the only thing that really changed is the way X was connected to the numbered games, and that was done all the way back in 2017 with Xenoblade 2. You can see my video on Xenoblade retcons for a little bit more about that. So my complaints aren't that this stuff happened, it's that all of this stuff happened way too quickly and in a way where there wasn't a lot of connective tissue from chapter 12 to 13, so it feels a little disjointed, and then also that it's so condensed that we don't get as big of a farewell to the planet of Mira and as many answers as I and a lot of people who love X would have liked. Another thing to be cognizant of is the fact that a lot of people really seem to have wanted all of the concept art from the original X's art book that wasn't used in the game to become canon in some way or another, exactly as it was depicted in that book. I certainly fell for this as well. I kept playing through the epilogue thinking, oh, they're going to explain why Kaldros is rough. They're going to explain why Kaldros is rough. When that never happened, and it's likely that was never canon because it was only ever in the concept art. Concept art is just that, a concept. It is an idea for something they might want to put in the game, not something they guaranteed were going to put in the final version of the game with their original vision back in 2015 and then chose not to nowadays because they wanted to ruin X and have some sort of agenda against it or whatever. I say all this because we can clearly see in the Blade Tower HQ room here that there is a holographic globe of Mira that has only the 5 continents from the game on it. Does it make much sense for Kaldros to be at the North Pole of the planet and NLA to basically be on top of the South Pole? Not really, but here is a depiction of the entirety of Mira in the game itself that shows there are not more landmasses on it like appeared in some concept art, and stuff that is in the game has to take precedence when it comes to canon, so we have in fact explored the entirety of Mira in Xenoblade X. And the fact that you can't loop around to the other side, and that the world doesn't appear round when you fly up high enough, are gameplay abstractions that were either brought on by intentional decisions or technical limitations. We'll definitely talk more about the relative sizes of things when we get to the White Whale 2. Anyway though, it's time to investigate the DMAT event in Oblivia, where we are tasked to protect and take on ghosts. And this is our first instance of literally just something from Xenosaga. I have been saying that the ghosts are basically just the Gnosis for a very long time, long before XDE was ever announced, but what DE actually did is make them even more like them than I expected they'd be. We already knew that they could phase through matter and are extremely hard to hit, but new to DE we learn that they're associated with the destruction of worlds and religious things, that they're not sentient but appear to act as a force of nature with no direct will of their own, and as we'll learn a lot later, they're attracted to the conduit and conduit emulating devices, like how the Gnosis are attracted to the Zohar and Zohar emulators in Saga. Throughout the entirety of the epilogue, all we really do is defend against the ghosts and escape them in the end, so this is also another plot thread that could be picked up on in a future game, and there were enough things suggesting that Gnosis likes were going to be relevant to the Numbered Trilogy as well, that I'm almost certain they're going to be an important enemy faction later on. Unlike the Gnosis in Saga, we don't get a true origin or explanation to exactly what the ghosts are, but given other things, I'm pretty sure it is going to be the exact same explanation as Saga. Xenosaga only ever takes place in one universe, and the fact that multiple universes exist is only something in supplemental lore material for Saga 3, so while they've been known to ravage planets, the ghosts ultimately come off as the most dangerous version of this in the entire Xeno series so far, because they've been present and at least partially responsible for the destruction of 3 entire universes by the end of chapter 13. The fact that there are a bunch of different kinds of ghosts with different sizes and power levels is also consistent with Saga. There are a lot of small ones that are fought as regular enemies on foot, larger ones that are designed for mech battles, and then really, really big ones that are only able to be fought off really by ships that are only cutscene enemies, and you'll need Cosmos to do something you absolutely can't do in gameplay to actually defeat them. Additionally, there's also a dungeon called the Cathedral Ship in Xenosaga 1. By the way, there is an enemy called Ghost Cathedral in XDE that is an entire planet that was transformed into a Gnosis, And that's consistent, albeit even larger in scale, than the giant ghost mothership we see in the battle over Earth, which appears to be comparable in size to the moon. Also, if you look closely at the opening cutscene, you can actually see every single ghost design that's used in the epilogue there. You can even see a bunch of the big guys that show up at the end of the battle right before the jump in the final cutscene, and realize just how small they are compared to truly massive ghosts. So, next time they show up, humanity's probably got to step their game up quite a bit. There are two notable differences, if you can even call it that, between the ghosts and the Gnosis. In Saga, it seems like you need to be touched by a Gnosis in order to get turned into salt, whereas in XDE, even the enemy index's objective description of things says that it's just the light ghosts give off that's capable of salting people. That being said, the salting happens exactly once in the epilogue, in the very first scene the ghosts are introduced in, and is never directly mentioned after that, so I'm pretty sure that the only reason it happens in the first place is just so people who have played Saga can get clued into the fact that these guys are Gnosis. The other difference is exactly how the intangibility works, and even then it could be argued that the only discrepancy is because the Gnosis are explained far more than the ghosts are. Gnosis are entities from outside the physical plane of existence, so in order to cross over into it, there needs to be one point where they do intersect with it, called the Klein point in the Saga games, and that is the one place they can be damaged by physical weapons. In XDE, ghosts have organs that generate an invulnerability field, and targeting the active organ represented by X's appendage system, which I think is a very cool gameplay thing. It's neat that they are actually forcing you to interact with appendages, which you don't really ever need to do in the main game. And targeting that specific organ, the one that's glowing on each of the different types of ghosts, is how they're damaged. The Klein point isn't explained any more than that in Saga, and whether or not ghosts are the exact same kind of non-physical entity isn't directly stated in XDE, so it is distinctly possible that they are exactly the same, and there just isn't enough information in both directions to confirm just how big the overlap between the two of them is. Basically, we know the Klein point is stored in the balls on ghosts, but we don't know if Gnosis even have them. For as long as I'm going to talk, I don't want to make this literally just a plot summary with additional lore analysis, so we are going to skip all the way to Elma's explanation of her backstory. While I do think one of the biggest problems of the epilogue is its tendency to tell don't show, and the fact that a lot of lore details and pieces of background information are just dumped in long monologues by either Elma or Al instead of being organically discovered throughout the course of a longer campaign like I'm sure was originally intended, I'm really glad Elma gets this moment to explain everything and we actually get to learn her past and all that. And even though Al does show up and he is the hero, Elma gets several important moments for her and actually feels like a more well-rounded character who has progression. Lynn continues her phenomenal character arc, and I think, honestly, even though she's not nominally the protagonist, I think she is the core of X's story, and Cross gets several more moments to be emotive or do cool things apart from the other characters as well. Just because Al is called the hero doesn't mean he wants to be seen as that, and doesn't mean he just shows up and immediately hijacks the entire plot, sidelining every other major character. Like, you could definitely argue that Al directly replaces Doug in terms of the fact that he's an old military friend and a pilot who has a past relationship with Lau, but I don't know. Doug was never very interesting to me. The most important thing about him was the fact that he is voiced by Patrick Seitz in the dub, so I could make all the Dogi jokes I wanted to, and you could still do that with Al playing his original role, so I don't know. Anyway, though, we can see a little bit of the buildings and people from Elma's civilization, and it does have a lot of Alchemoth vibes to me, honestly, though obviously a lot more technologically advanced and sci-fi instead of steampunk-ish fantasy themed. If you really want to reach, you could say that their clothes are similar to Albedo's outfit from Xenosaga, but if they're referencing anything from another Xeno game, it's just the High-Entia and the fact that they are elf people who are more advanced but related to humanity. Another important thing is debunking the alleged contradiction between what Elma and Al say. Elma says that her planet is from a far-off corner of the universe, but in the ending, Al says that Elma's planet and its entire universe were destroyed, and then she made it over into Earth's universe. We have to keep in mind that Elma is an unreliable narrator. Al, being someone who was in the Rift for a time, seeing things from an outside perspective, and then also having his mind mixed with Void and learning some of Void's stuff, is the one with the most complete and objective knowledge of things, and so people like Elma are only speaking with their best knowledge. Elma's people were fighting the Ganglion over their planet long before it was destroyed and Elma left, so it's not like there weren't a bunch of people who would not shut up about eradicating the descendants of Samar, who could tip people off to the fact that, yeah, there are other planets out there somewhere that have Samarian descendants. And then there's the fact that the Ares is already shown to be able to transfer between universes, and that it is somewhat capable of responding to desires and bringing people to where they're needed. So as long as Elma set out from her planet, knowing there are other Samarian descendants out there somewhere in creation, it does make sense that she would end up at Earth eventually, even if it was located in another universe. The way her people discovered the Ares, developed their technology around it, and retrofitted it to work with their knowledge of weaponry and stuff is one of the few references to Xenogears anywhere in this epilogue, as that's basically how that world views gears, or their mechs. They discover them as relics in ancient ruins, and they develop their own weapon technology and other technology based on them, while also jury-rigging them to work with whatever tech they've been able to figure out. In fact, we can even see in some of the CGs of Elma's people fighting the Ganglion, there are multiple Ares units. Obviously, the Prime was the most important one and probably the most powerful, but it seems like similar to how Earth was developing the Prague Ares, and you can later craft the Ares 70 and 90, Elma's people did develop all of their mechs around the Ares model. They were just able to get a lot closer to it a lot quicker than humanity was. All human-made skells are developed based around the Ares tech, but they weren't able to closely replicate the Ares until after they'd already landed on Mira. I think we can also somewhat reasonably guess that Ares is not literally the name Elma's people call it. Yeah, Void does just call it the Ares without any real argument, but he's probably able to just read in people's minds and use whatever words they use for things. I think a fairly reasonable guess is that Elma's people uncovered it, realized it was some sort of strong weapons platform, named it after one of their own war gods, and then after Elma came to Earth, it was rechristened the Ares, this time naming it after an important Earth war god, which then led into all of the skell frames having religious or mythological naming themes behind them. It's also very worth noting and extremely hilarious that the Prime Ares' arts are all other Greek mythological references, similar to the name Ares itself, while the Prague and craftable Ares frames are all Hindu references. So, while yeah, obviously the Ares 70 and 90 are way more powerful gameplay-wise, it's funny to note that the human-made Areses didn't match the religion of the frame name and the weapon names, and maybe that is canonically why they weren't as powerful as the Prime or the ones made by Elma's people. I don't know. It's also this conversation that directly confirms that Elma bringing the Ares to Earth is Xenoblade X's equivalent of the discovery of the Zohar, something that happens on Earth in every single other game in the Xeno series. Listen to this. A powerful relic capable of providing infinite energy is discovered on Earth in the early 21st century. Initially, it leads to a massive boom in technology, but then that leads into warfare, humans fleeing the planet, and the eventual loss of Earth as a whole. I have just described the background of Earth in Xenogears, Xenosaga, and the numbered Xenoblade trilogy as a future redeemed. In Gears, the Zohar was discovered in 2001 because you were allowed to be less subtle without getting sued back in 1998. In Saga, it was discovered more nebulously in the early 21st century, but at the specific location of Lake Turkana in Kenya. In the numbered Xenoblade games, it's called the Conduit. It looks a little different, and they didn't specify exactly where in Kenya it was discovered, but more or less the exact same thing happens. And now, in Xenoblade X, we have Elma arriving on Earth, bringing the Prime Ares, a device that's not literally the Conduit, but does contain the cores with power based on it, that causes more or less the same thing. And based on the timing, she arrived on Earth in either 2024 or 2026, depending on how you want to view the 2 years the White Whale spent in space, so that is the equivalent of this. Also, while there are several more indicators of it, this is our first bit of explicit confirmation that the Earth of Xenoblade X and the Earth of the numbered games are different Earths. It takes Al melding minds with Void in the Rift to even learn that the Ares cores are based on the Conduit, which you would think humanity would have been able to figure out on their own and then tell the pilot of the Ares about if they had Klaus's Conduit there to look at and examine. You know, it's a real shame there wasn't anyone pointing out to people that the Earths weren't the same, using evidence from the games ever since Future Redeemed came out and put that false idea in people's heads. I bet if someone like that did exist, they would have only gotten respect from the community for trying to curtail the spread of misinformation, and absolutely wouldn't have been clowned on for a year and a half for saying things that ended up being proven completely true. Anyway, now we're talking about the first Void Vita fight and our first actual introduction to Al as a character. I kind of underrated the power level of things going on here in my initial analysis. At that point, we pretty much realized that we were going to be fighting the Vita piloted by the Great One, and I was thinking, okay, it's confirmed that Luxar piloting the Vita was only at 30% capacity, so we're dealing with someone that's only a little bit more than 3 times stronger, except we never fight the Vita while Void is piloting it without the Ares cores as well. So I think the power increase is actually more than just going from 30% to 100%, because I'm assuming the 30% statistic was not counting the cores, which is kind of nuts. It has slight shades of Dragon Ball Super where everyone just kind of inexplicably gets exponentially stronger between arcs to be able to keep up with people who are even weaker than the main characters, but the only ghosts we really see people actually defeating are the same kinds that we see people defeating in the opening cutscene, so people already have experience fighting those. And it seems like a lot of the more high-powered fights are just the Ares Prime still being strong even without the cores, and Cross being built different, somewhat carrying a weaker rest of the party. Anyway, though, you want to hear about something I was completely wrong about? Al's race. He is in fact human, and he's so human that he is the only human in his original human body and not a mimeosome. I thought that maybe he was another member of Elma's race, but nope, he is just a guy, and honestly, that's even better. I am very largely positive on Al as a character. He's going to get his own video eventually, so don't worry about me kind of glossing over a lot of his character stuff here. But I think that if they made him actually special, he would have been much more annoying than he is. Genuinely, the reason he is the hero is because he's a very good Scowl pilot. The explanation is unironically that he is very talented, and I'm pretty happy about that. I think if he actually was some kind of cosmic chosen one and wasn't a reluctant hero who really doesn't like taking credit for things that other people did or being viewed in such a high regard, he would be really annoying and a much, much worse character that I don't think I'd really be able to like much at all. Being an Americana-obsessed, dumb super robot protagonist is probably the best case for what this character could end up being. So I'm pretty satisfied with the reveal of who the lone hero actually was. If you want some real proof that Al just steals Doug's role in the cast, the first thing Doug does in the base game is get out of a Skell that crashed, take his helmet off, and shout "damn it." And the very first thing Al does on screen is get out of a Skell that crashed, take his helmet off, and say damn. There you go. Also, "How's it poppin'" is legitimately an accurate translation of what he says in Japanese, and it's supposed to be stupid on purpose. The only characters who immediately go with the bit and laugh at it are the people who already knew Al on Earth and were familiar with his shtick, and are just happy to have him back, so of course they're gonna laugh along with him. Other characters like Gwyn and Tatsu get screwed over by it because they just want to be in on the joke and be seen as cool. And that is also part of the humor. Like, if you don't find it funny, fine, humor is completely subjective, but saying that they tried to make it funny unironically when in-universe it's only funny ironically is incorrect. There's literally a scene where Tatsu gets confused about why he says it so much, and Doug says it's his idea of a gag, don't get too hung up on it, and then they explain the entire thing in excruciating detail, and it's also supposed to be stupid on purpose. Now, granted, they repeat it enough, and they just keep escalating the stupidity, where it does manage to loop around to being unironically peak during the final boss fight, but that's a completely different story. Bringing Bernholt back to NLA, we get what probably caused the second biggest pop-off I had during my entire playthrough of the Epilogue, and that is, of course, Elma just straight up quoting from the Bible, which is one of the most quintessentially Xeno things you can do, and unless you count the verses from Proverbs that are associated with each core of the Trinity processor, which are only ever depicted in Latin and never directly pointed out or read by anyone, this is the first time something like this has happened since Xenosaga. And while it's not the most Xenosaga thing to happen in this epilogue, it is both a very funny and very nostalgic thing to have back, and I hope this existing puts to bed the notion that there are Nintendo-related things preventing Xenosaga from getting re-released, or that they wouldn't be able to go full Xeno with it if they wanted to in a future Blade game, because, well, here we have new content in a 2025 release literally reading Bible verses out loud. And even back in 2015, the original game, which was localized in North America, people did generally speak pretty naturally, and that included saying things like, "oh my god, thank god," all the time. So yeah, this is not the 90s anymore. Nintendo's not gonna stop them from putting religious themes in their Xeno game if they want to do that. Anyway, Elma here is quoting from the Book of Revelation, the King James Version of chapter 9, verses 13 through 15, and the notion that the biblical apocalypse is actually some sort of memory from humanity's ancestors trying to warn them through the generations about the ghosts coming and potentially destroying the world is a very intriguing one. It seems to indicate that there is a through line from ancient Samar to all of their descendants. Elma's people were much more aware of their heritage, and the Ares itself was actually on their planet, and while humanity didn't know any of this until Elma and the Manon were able to tell them about the Federation and all that stuff, they did still have that ancestral memory of the ghosts causing the apocalypse, and that became part of their religious texts. Like, keep in mind, Elma is quoting from the New Testament specifically here because this is a Xeno game, but it's not like Christianity is the only religion that has prophecies of the end of the world in it. And this all kind of touches on a core tenet of the Xeno series that not a lot of people seem to look at. And that is the fact that throughout all of Xeno, it never says you're wrong for believing in a higher power. The entire series is very, very frequently critical of organized religion and the ways it can become corrupt, and how it can completely ignore the messages it claims to teach and hurt countless people, but it never says that a higher power doesn't exist or that you are wrong for having faith in one. Basically, every problem that happens throughout the Xeno series, even ones that seem to be divine on first glance, are ultimately caused by humans misusing absolute power for selfish reasons. And if something suggesting at a higher power beyond that ever does show up in a given game, it's almost always altruistic and actively rewards or tries to help out the people who are trying to make other people's lives better. Basically, what I'm getting at here is Tatsu being the one to say that God is probably real is perfect use of Tatsu, and one of the funniest things a Xeno game has ever done. And honestly, I have zero issues with how Tatsu is portrayed in this epilogue. He's not annoying, he actually participates in conversations, and is a genuinely good supporting character for Lyn when she gets little bits of development here. And there are no food jokes. Yeah, he gets called different kinds of food by different characters, but that's all it is, a side gag that's not even pointed out directly by anyone else. L, unfortunately, on the other hand, is completely flanderized out of existence. His entire character now becomes, okay, we want something funny to happen in this cutscene, we will give L a line and make him say a phrase wrong every single time. All of his lines in chapter 13 are this. While I think Tatsu's role in any future game he appears in should be something like the epilogue, he is the straight man to all the Xeno bullshit that keeps happening around him and is the one who can be bewildered now that Cross even seems to be getting in on it. L really needs to go back to how he was written in the original game. While there are enough hints dropped for me to pretty reasonably figure out what L's deal is, it is pretty annoying they didn't actually touch on it at all in the epilogue. Meanwhile, I think it gets funnier the longer they go without explaining anything about why Nopon are on Mira. Like, that is definitely not a revelation you want to drop in the epilogue to XDE. Figuring out why these guys just keep popping up everywhere in the multiverse should be a big revelation that's played partially for a joke in the climax of a major full-length Xenoblade game at this point. Also, I think this is our first real indicator of something that will be important in later games that's being set up here, because everybody, including Al, who is by far the most knowledgeable at this point in time, agree that God is probably real, and then this is never mentioned or brought up again throughout the rest of the game. So, clearly they mean to do something with this eventually, right? Elma and Al's conversation in the hangar after this is genuinely a good character building moment for both of them and explains a lot about their respective philosophies, but you can come back for the Al video if you want me to actually talk about that part. I'm here to talk about something else, and that is to explain that no, they did not retcon the existence of a tandem Skell out of the game, and yes, that is still the Ares Prime. While it's expanded a little bit in the short stories, from the original game itself, all we know about the existence of a tandem Skell is that in the battle over Earth, there was a tandem Skell that was the first one to take part in the battle and was largely responsible for the white whale getting away in the first place. But Elma deflects, says she doesn't want to talk about it and that it didn't matter in the end when Lyn tries to pressure her on the matter. Doug also does almost go out and say Al's name here, and while I do think the name Alois Bernholt was not decided on for this character until long after the original X came out, it is very, very clear that this kind of character was always going to be who Elma's partner was. She mentions his love of cars in a heart-to-heart, and lo and behold, one of Al's heart-to-hearts in DE is about his love of cars. Several different conversations with her in Xenoblade 2 have her mention that her partner was referred to as the hero, and she even brings up that he seemed to be a fan of Japanese culture. And while Al is obviously very big on American stuff, he does mention liking sushi as well, so he might have been a closet weeb in addition to loving America so much. Anyway though, the reality behind events is revealed in this conversation. During the battle over Earth, Elma was so focused on directing her team and making sure they were doing alright that Al took the Ares that they were both piloting together usually on his own. So Elma was not actually there despite it being a tandem scale, and that is what resulted in him being lauded as the hero and then being made, as Elma directly says, the sole pilot of the Ares, implying that before that moment, the Ares had more than one pilot, and Elma is the only other person we see pilot the Prime up until the final boss fight of this epilogue. While, like I said, concept art is not canon, when we do see the cockpit of the Prime, it does look identical to how it is depicted in the same concept art where it was shown to have seating for two. Why do we never use it as a tandem scale in the game? Well, the reason Al was made the sole pilot in the first place was because people realized he didn't need Elma as training wheels anymore, and Elma is a much better leader than he is, so her talents were better suited to being an officer and directing people like that, while Al piloted the Ares and did more heroics. They both became so good at their respective roles, not to say Elma's a bad pilot by any stretch, that it was more efficient for them to not use it as a tandem scale and do their own thing. That's why Al was taken off of Team Elma and promoted. Gameplay-wise, first off, before you get the ability to equip the Prime to anyone after beating the Epilogue, which is probably non-canon in the first place, there are very few party members who would even be able to get in the Ares and make it work in the first place. If the requirement is just a warm body, then that limits it to Elma, El, the Chlorians, and Gajarg. If you need connections to the original Samarians, that gets rid of Gajarg and maybe El, though I disagree with that. And if you specifically need the blood of Samar, then barring my theories about El and the Chlorians also being different descendants, that literally just leaves you with only Elma, and at that point, why would you even make a tandem scale mechanic for one other party member? I get why they didn't want to go through the effort of doing this, especially since no one else is even trained in using tandem scales besides specifically those two. As for the final battle, why is Al standing there and not just sitting in the other seat? Well, just because the concept art showed what seems to be one interconnected cockpit doesn't mean that's how it actually is in the final game. Al was in the main seat when he got absorbed by Void, and Cross pretty clearly climbs into the same cockpit Al flops out of. Plus, if it does have two cockpits, there's probably one cockpit that you need to be in if you're operating it alone anyway. Plus, I think him still being in the main cockpit is what allowed Cross to pilot it in the first place, and Cross gets out at the end and gets back in their own scale to go back to the White Whale because the same reason Elma and Al didn't keep piloting the Ares as a unit. It's better to have two skells piloted by two separate ace pilots than sticking two people in one super skell that can be used almost as well with only one person in it. Also, they have no idea how this battle is going to go and how resources are going to be even if they do escape. I think they would want to bring back Cross's skell so they had an additional unit to work with regardless of anything else. Also, it seems like the part of the skell the cockpit is in is from the new construction by Elma's people and not the original Samarian stuff, so they could have taken out the second cockpit to make it more energy efficient when they made Al the sole pilot. The other flashback of Elma trying to stop Al from going out on his own in the Ares is also from the battle over Earth and not the battle over Mira, so this all still holds. If any contradiction at all exists, it is in the battle over Mira, because in the short story Forging Blade, Elma does say that she was fighting the ghosts in a tandem scale with a young man, and that after the scale ended up outside the ship, he threw her back inside and then they lost contact. After this, she gets an Avirus and rejoins the fight, which is why that's the scale frame she's most associated with in promotional material. And in Act 2, when Al talks about getting sucked into the rift, the only time we see the cutscene from his POV is after getting outside the ship, though it is cutting it kind of close. So all of that could have still happened, but I think that instead of the Forging Blade depiction of events, What really happened is something similar to the cutscenes about Earth, where Elma wanted to go and fight with him, but he told her to stay there and that he was going to handle things himself, because this is described in the lyrics of the song In the Forest. She was standing there in the hangar, the hatch was open then, there's no one there, he was drifting along in the universe, that was the last time I saw his face. Which is clearly about the same events and even describes Al drifting in the universe, which could describe him in the Rift. Another implication that, yes, they had a lot of this planned way back with the original X in 2015, except that she was never thrown back into NLA by the Ares, she just never got on the Ares in the first place, which I think is more likely, but there's enough ambiguity and the fact that all of Elma and Al's conversations about his recklessness had to do with the fight over Earth and they just never acknowledged the fight over Mira, that indicates that maybe it could still be that way too. While there aren't any big lore things to talk about or potential retcons to discuss, I do also really love Lynn's conversation with Cross that happens right after Elma's with Al. Throughout this DE playthrough, I've become a much bigger fan of Lynn than I already was, and honestly, I come to realize that while Elma is the poster girl for X and will always be the one who shows up whenever they need to show a character from every Xenoblade game, in terms of growing and changing and how much other people are affected by their actions, Lynn is actually the protagonist of Xenoblade X. Cross is your avatar and someone who gets a lot of cool moments and all of that, but by being a silent protagonist, you can't really say they're the one who grows and changes and influences other people. And Elma and Al, while they do develop and change and have defined personalities, they're static enough and their influence on people in the world is already locked in by the time you first meet them, while Lynn is the one who really changes the most, and there is a bit of an emphasis on how much of a positive influence Lynn is on other people later in this epilogue, and I'm a really big fan of all of that. Lynn is becoming one of my favorite Xenoblade characters in all honesty, and I would really love to see her grow even more in a future game. Also, well, yeah, there are some criticisms that can be levied at the dub performances of the returning characters in the epilogue. Cassandra Lee Morris just completely pops off every single time Lynn has to do something other than talk flatly. Like, her Al impression is amazing, and she gets way more emotion out of her lines than she did even in the most emotional Lynn moments in the main game, and I'm a really big fan. That being said, people are definitely way too harsh on the returning voice actors. It's been a decade and it is confirmed to be a different English voice director than the original game. Why were you expecting anyone to sound exactly the same as they did in 2015? Also, some characters are just given way more material than others. I'm not about to fault Ray Chase for the fact that L's performance is not particularly great in the epilogue, because it's not like he has a lot of material to work with compared to the main game. This is not the same situation as recurring VAs in the numbered games, in which case the longest time in between appearances is also 10 years, but it was Jenna Coleman between original Xenoblade 1 and Future Connected, and she sounds noticeably different there, but exactly the same in Xenoblade 3 as in Future Connected, and it's a great voice for an older Melia, but I digress. The only dub VA who actually got to reprise their role as a Xenoblade X character in between the original Wii U version of X and XDE was Caitlin Glass as Elma for her appearance in the Xenoblade 2 DLC, which released in 2018. It has been 7 years for exactly one person and 10 years for everyone else. I'm not going to fault anyone for sounding different here. I absolutely think it's amazing they were able to get this many VAs back though. Genuinely impressed by the production values when it comes to that. Across both languages, there are only 4 people who do not reprise their role for a character who has new voice lines, and on the Japanese side it was due to a tragic death and a retirement. Does Vandam seem extremely jarring and a voice that doesn't fit his character in DE? Absolutely, but that's not exactly Gavin Hammond's fault. It's a perfectly good performance, it just doesn't fit the character at all, and I'm really miffed that they didn't even bother attempting to cast a sound-alike for Darren DePaul's original performance, especially because Kat Pratano does a rock-solid Aaron Fitzgerald impression for the Soldier Cross voice. The only other thing that really irks me when it comes to the dub in DE is that they changed the pronunciation of the 4th continent from Silvalum to Silvalum, which just comes off as extremely amateurish because it means the voice directors never went back to the original game and used that as a reference for specific terminology. This is especially upsetting because when comparing certain issues with Xenoblade 2's localization to 3's, it really seems like there was someone on 3's localization team who was specifically going and pointing out references to other Xeno games to make sure they were translated properly so that people reading it in a language other than Japanese were aware that it was a reference to something. Like, they went out of their way to inaccurately translate terminology to be consistent with pre-existing inaccurate localized names for things, and there's no way to do that unless you're doing it on purpose. And yet here, it seems like they didn't even use the original version of the game they were working on a definitive edition of for reference, which just seems really sloppy, especially because they still get the name of the conduit correct when that shows up. And while there aren't any other things from Xeno games that are mentioned directly by name in any language, it's just weird that they were consistent with the localized name of something that was only mentioned by name in Xenoblade 2, but not with the pronunciation of something that was said a bunch of times in the original version of Xenoblade X. I don't really have anything to say about the rest of these conversations or Void revealing himself, so next we need to talk about parallel universes. The first thing I think is really neat to point out is the diagram up on the screen while Lynn is discussing the fact that multiple universes exist in the first place is reminiscent of Penrose diagrams, something created by physicist Roger Penrose in order to describe as best you possibly can in 2 dimensions how space-time works in different configurations of the universe and around situations where space-time gets screwy like black holes. Even though it's never rigorously worked out, and the Zohar is always somewhere around the corner, and that's something that breaks physics by definition of it existing in the first place, I love how Xeno games always love basing their sci-fi concepts in real science. It's definitely going in a big extrapolation more inspired by than hard science fiction, but it's still really, really cool to be able to open a textbook and see something the writers were inspired by. Anyway, Mira is confirmed to be in a different universe from Earth. That's crazy. I wonder if anyone's been saying that for literally years now. There's not really enough evidence to confirm or deny whether or not my theories about it being a special kind of pocket dimension are true, but there is clearly something weird about Mira that they haven't told us yet that does seem like it could be a future revelation, even though Mira in its universe no longer exists at the end of XDE, so I'm confident we'll learn whether or not I'm right about that as well at some point in the future. Something I definitely never saw coming was the fact that Earth's universe was completely destroyed when Earth was. The white light that led to everyone ending up on Mira wasn't just people getting teleported there or dragged into another universe, it was the universe ceasing to exist and them crossing over into a completely different one. It seems like the process of going from Earth's universe to Mira's universe, something that did not just happen to the White Whale, but also the Manon ship and plenty of other crafts, happened imperceptibly to the point that people didn't realize it had happened until they had the Ares data to confirm it. This means while they probably did end up going through the rift, they just didn't notice at that time, so they probably didn't spend a whole lot of time there, and the entire trip lasted only during the amount of time the white light was shown, because no one even perceived other consciousnesses or universes or anything like that. Seems like relative to your own time, you need to spend a decent amount of time in there like Al did to be aware that any of that stuff even exists. This throws a whole lot of intrigue into the fact that the White Whale was able to intercept transmissions in French and Japanese before it landed on Mira. In the original game, you just kind of assumed that, okay, there are other ships that ended up on Mira with the White Whale, but now that we know for sure we have explored the entirety of the planet, that Earth's universe was destroyed, and that Mira's universe was destroyed, what happened to those ships? Because I don't think they're gone. You have to keep in mind, the White Whale ending up in Mira's universe did not have anything to do with the Ares and its ability to transfer between them. Other ships ended up there without an Ares of their own. There's also the fact that the whole collective unconscious thing is only relevant because the Lifehold Core's databanks were destroyed. If that hadn't happened, people would have still been able to download themselves into physical bodies from the Lifehold computers with no real issue. Theoretically, if another ship using the Lifehold model the White Whale used ended up in another universe, everyone in that Lifehold would have been backed up to the collective unconscious just like the people on the Whale were. But as long as the ship did not crash and its Lifehold remained intact, they would have been able to revive everyone on board just like originally intended. And one of the ships that used the model of actually bringing physical bodies in stasis wouldn't have had any issues with any of that stuff whatsoever. So I am now of the opinion that the White Whale received those foreign language transmissions while in the rift. Those did come from other ships that managed to escape the destruction of Earth and its universe, and they ended up in universes other than the one that had Mira. This is our first instance of easy layup for a concept for Xenoblade X 2. We always thought that those other ships would have been a potential plot thread for the future, but that was always through the lens of, okay, they land somewhere else on Mira and eventually hook up with NLA, but you can make a completely disconnected Xenoblade X 2 that has nothing to do with anything else in the series other than the gameplay and the concept of Project Exodus by following one of those other ships and the universe and planet it ends up in. It was the energy of Earth's universe being destroyed that shunted people into Miras. Just like with the potential of people being flung into many other places than just Bionis and Alrest by Klaus's experiment, I would love to see what happens when someone got flung a different direction through the rift than the White Whale was flung. This is also our second piece of explicit confirmation that Klaus's Earth and the Earth from Xenoblade X are different planets in different universes. While Klaus did destroy Earth in several different ways and did a lot of weird things with other universes, there was still a universe left outside of Earth for the planet to be reformed in at the end of Future Redeemed. Seeing how the entirety of X-Earth's universe ceased to exist and never comes back throughout the rest of the game, it clearly can't be the same one. That is everything I want to talk about for Act 1, and I know you're looking at the timestamp and are seeing that that was almost as long as Act 1 itself, but I had to do a lot of setting up the groundwork, and a lot of Acts 2 and 3 are either just pure gameplay sections or have to do with character interactions that are outside the scope of this video, so I think we're going to start moving a lot faster from now on. You can tell now that that was a massive lie, but I am keeping it in because it is really funny in hindsight. Now, I say this, and the first two things I need to talk about in Act 2 are explaining the Xenosaga references behind Volataris, and then Al's explanation of the Rift, so it'll pick up after that. Once you leave NLA for the first time, Act 2 really does feel like 3 affinity missions stapled together. Like, say, these were all written out originally as affinity missions, and if the full, complete version of the end of X's story was there, they'd all be required affinity missions, but outside of main story chapters. The first one feels like an Al one on top of the 2 ones that we actually do have in the game, one of which is required. The second part feels like a Lin one, and I don't really know who the third one would necessarily be about, but maybe it's condensing several ideas that would have been explored through multiple other characters. Anyway though, Volataris is in part an analog to the Song of Nephilim, a space station that serves as one of the final dungeons of Xenosaga Episode 1, and also, funnily enough, apparently predicted the Trinity processor. The colors are the same and the order's the same, it's just the orientation that's off. It's not an exact comparison because the song is not a prison for any being or anything like that, but it gives off a psychic signal that can induce madness in people who hear it, with Realians, genetically engineered beings created by humans, being particularly susceptible to that. The song tends to just drive people mad, but that is, I think, a pretty significant correlation with Void being able to use Volataris to induce zealotry in the members of the Ganglion. And while most of the Ganglion that still remain after Chapter 13 are races that were enslaved by them and not the original Ganglion created by the Samarians, it's still Void being a Samarian able to control the organization created by the Samarians. And since I kind of view the Samarian civilization as a much more decadent, more advanced, possibly even more corrupt version of Xenosaga's galaxy-spanning human civilization, I think this was intentional. The Song of Nephilim was created as part of a system to control the Zohar, and it's said to summon the Gnosis whenever it's activated, while Volataris is controlled by Void using the Zohar emulator cores of the Ares he stole, and his plan is to use the ghosts to create this contest for survival in every universe. I'm not sure how to feel about the new Manon voice filter. It certainly sounds different than the original, although I can still definitely hear the words they're trying to say without the subtitles. I don't know, I feel like it's a similar thing to Vandom, where if X2 comes out and they start sounding like that right off the bat, it will be easier to get used to, but going from stuff in the original X that sounded one way to this sounding very jarring and new, even if it isn't objectively bad, does still sting a bit. I also don't know why they're so obsessed with not giving us any new named Manon characters here. Like, in Act 3, there will be the Manon representative on the White Whale 2, next to Gajarg, Prince of the Rothians, and Maurice Chausson, Director General of New Los Angeles, and it's really, really weird. Yeah, I know my man-on voice filter opinions are definitely the hard-hitting pieces of information you want to know, and not the discussion on the other thing that happens in this scene, which is the explanation of the rift and how the Xenoblade multiverse works. Setting aside the fact that Al only even escaped the rift and made it to Mira in the first place because he's watched enough sci-fi movies to know to shut his brain off when he's getting overwhelmed with data, the only really big thing is the explanation of exactly how the multiverse is structured and the fact that it is basically identical to Xenosaga. It was really nice sitting through those scenes and realizing something that I was pretty sure was true but didn't have any direct confirmation of be completely laid out to be true. Why am I not extending this to the clips of the other games and the confirmation that they exist in different universes in the same multiverse? Because I knew that already, and that was the only way X could ever have fit in with the other games already. And you can't even say this is me coping for Xenosaga, because I have an unwatchably bad video from 2018 discussing ways you could connect X to 2, where I debunk the possibility of Klaus's Earth and X's Earth being the same, using evidence that's never became outdated and is just as true now as it was back then, before I'd even played Gears and Saga, and before Torna had even come out. The first thing I debunked was Moritha being Mira, which was not really something a lot of people were thinking in the first place. And the third part, the theory, was that the Samarians were other people from Klaus's Earth that got shifted away during the experiment, which probably isn't true. But even back then, my leading explanation for how you could connect X to the other games was that it is one of the countless universes Klaus confirms exist all the way back in Xenoblade 2. X showed a destruction of Earth that was inconsistent with the numbered Xenoblade games when it first came out in 2015, before there were other numbered Xenoblade games. Klaus confirmed the multiverse existed in Xenoblade 2 in 2017. Takahashi drew emphasis to the fact the multiverse existed and very heavily implied X was part of the same flow of space-time as 1 and 2 in 2020, and then nothing to counteract that ever happened until 2025, where it was confirmed that the thing that was obvious was in fact true. I do actually know what I'm talking about sometimes. I will say though, the view of the other universes within the Rift is a Xenogears reference. The color choices used and the shattered glass motif probably at first bring to mind Shulk's visions from Xenoblade 1 and the tags used for those in battle, and that does make sense. It seems like it's more of a purely alternate universe style multiverse, not an alternate timeline thing, but looking into other universes as things that could have been does align with that. However, that's not the reference they're going for here. This is another elusive Xenogears reference in Chapter 13. If you look around, the colors are a lot more varied than just Shulk visions, and whenever a shard of glass is not showing a clip from another Xenoblade game, it's just reflecting the sky background that's present elsewhere in the shot. You might even say that these shards of glass form a broken mirror reflecting a million shades of light, which is a very iconic line from Xenogears' ending theme, and it seems like that is a motif that's going to show up more in the series in the future, even though almost all of Xenogears' concepts have been used in Blade games already. The choice of scenes they show for each game is also kind of interesting to me. Well, yes, they are just very iconic scenes from each game showing some of the most important characters, you will notice that for all three, it is an important character-building conversation between one of the main couples of that game. And I don't think that was an unintentional choice, because the person in the Rift viewing all this is Al, the guy who is obsessed with the concept of love and that being a source of power. So it's pretty likely he saw at least some of the events of the other Xenoblade games take place, realized how important love was to those people and how much they loved their worlds, and that was enough for him to get kickstarted and realize that he still has a purpose to play, which then would lead into the Ares responding to that wish, finding where the souls of his friends were located in the collective unconscious, and then spitting him out in the universe where their physical bodies, or at least their mimeosomes, ended up. We should also definitely talk about time in the Rift, because I'm going to be completely honest, I have no idea how it works, and I think we're just going to need to wait for another game to explain it. Because the way Al describes his time there makes it feel like it was only a few minutes or hours, like a couple days at most, and not the several months he was gone relative to the rest of humanity. There's also the fact that the clips shown from the other games are from all three games. And while, yeah, I'm not sure if we should take those clips as literally things Al witnessed, or abstractions for the purpose of helping the player understand what's going on, using the games we actually know already as examples of the other universes Al was able to look into, while also just directly and explicitly showing how the games are connected, so everyone is on the same page with that, especially more casual fans who aren't following the series as deeply as you and I might have never even heard about the theories of connecting the games, or people for whom X is the first game in the series they're playing, and they're just putting popular characters on screen to try and encourage people to play the other games. Also, it might be relevant for the very ending of Chapter 13 too. I make these distinctions only because a clip of Xenoblade 3 is shown very shortly after Xenoblade 1 and 2, and that's weird not only because 3 takes place a couple decades after those games, but also because all of its story is compressed into one singular moment in time. The easiest thing to say is that time just doesn't exist in the Rift. Yeah, the collective unconscious is there, but we also explicitly see in the epilogue that when you die, your consciousness doesn't cease to exist. So whether or not it's in the Nexus is not determined by whether or not you're alive in a universe outside the Rift. The only problem with this is destroyed universes and stuff like that. If the Rift exists outside of time, and it's kind of arbitrary where on an individual universe's timeline you can gaze at it from, there was nothing stopping Al from going into the past of Earth's own universe, time traveling back in time, and then coming in with a second copy of himself in the Ares and immediately doubling humanity's firepower to try and fight off the invasion. I think the best way to look at that is that there is some sort of objective flow of time going on within the Rift that does not directly correspond to the flow of time across any other universes, and that when one is destroyed, at least by the ghosts, its entire space-time goes with it. So not just the physical universe, but also its entire timeline, its entire history. So no matter what time you're trying to look into it from the Rift, it won't be there. Even if we don't know which universe they all came from, I think we can pretty reasonably assume that every sentient race who ended up on Mira comes from a universe that's been destroyed, except maybe the Nopon if they're connected to the guys from the other games. So I think this does actually explain Professor B's situation. Remember, until Al shows up, nobody knows the multiverse exists. Professor B is trying to time travel, but he's not aware that he's in a different universe. Everyone thinks Mira is just some mysterious planet from the universe they originally came from. Professor B is trying to time travel to a timeline that no longer exists. So it's no wonder he keeps bouncing off some sort of barrier and ending up back where he started. He's trying to go somewhere and do something that is impossible because his universe has been destroyed and he's stuck on Mira like everyone else. It's also stated that people like the Ganglion and Manon have tried to escape the planet but keep ending up back there too, and I think I also know what's happening there. In the beginning of Chapter 6, Goetia states that the phenomenon space around Mira is 800 exodus in diameter, which means they can search it in 3 days traveling at light speed. Now, she's looking for the Great One, or the Samar Federation homeland, which is absolutely a plot thread that could still be picked up later, and states that they've pretty thoroughly looked everywhere and haven't been able to find anything. Now, this makes sense. Mira clearly is not the Samar Federation homeland, and we know where Void was at this point in time, but this basically confirms there's some kind of space barrier that is about 3 light days in diameter, which means it has a radius of about 1.5 light days. To convert that to something a bit more useful, that is just under 260 astronomical units, or AU, a unit defined as the average distance between the Earth and the Sun. This sounds like a massive distance, but keep in mind that is 3 light days, and the closest star to us is over 4 light years away. Proxima Centauri's distance is 269,000 AU away from the Sun, and we're talking about a radius around Mira of only 260. If you traveled this far away from the Sun, you would be pretty strictly considered still to be within the solar system. So on an astronomical scale, this is a very, very small piece of space. Later in Act 2, we also learn in no uncertain terms that beings created Mira. And I'm starting to think that my theories about it being some sort of haven for endangered races aren't too far off the mark again. And that it's not just that there's some phenomenon space surrounding the planet, but the stars are fake and the entire universe Mira's part of is only that 3 light day diameter bubble. So all of these hyper-advanced starships are leaving the atmosphere, accelerating up to superluminal speeds, ready to go at warp speed, trying to get anywhere else, and before they know it, they've reached the edge of the universe, and depending on how space-time is curved, either bounce off of that and find their way back at Mira, or loop back around to Mira. Not only does this make sense, not only is it consistent even with the epilogue and the new revelations there, but it also means there is still a large mystery about Mira that can absolutely be explored in a later Xenoblade X game, even though the planet itself and its universe are gone. By the way, Mira's sun and the way it moves across the sky does not operate the way it should from a regular planet, so there's a pretty good chance that's fake too, and the only real physical objects in the entire Mira universe are the planet and its moons. It's a neat way of going full circle too, because analyzing things like the sun and how they don't line up with how they should look if Mira was a real planet are where the theories about it being a weird made pocket dimension came from in the first place. Alright though, I've stalled long enough. Let's talk about the structure of the multiverse. Endless universes coexist side by side, yet all completely unaware of one another. The conduit is a link to these foreign worlds. The rift is the pathway between them, and also serves as the nexus for the consciousness of sentient life. This is very, very similar to the cosmology of Xenosaga, which I have explained before, but I'm going to do so again and try to be as simple as possible, because I don't want to make you look at this diagram, which does come from the Xenosaga 3 Perfect Guide, the entire time I'm talking about this stuff. According to Xenosaga, creation is split into the upper domain and the lower domain, with the multiverse as we know it existing within the lower. While the Saga games themselves only take place within one singular universe, supplemental material does explicitly confirm that there are other separate lower domain universes out there, they're just not relevant to those games. The upper domain is very ambiguously described, however it is a higher dimension than the lower, and is the source of the energy that powers the Xenosaga Zohar. In fact, the Zohar is a portal to the upper domain, and one could even say that the power coming from it is leaking out of some far-flung dimension. The upper domain does not seem to be just a realm of pure energy though, as sentient beings known as wave existences exist in it. These creatures are so unknowable and so powerful that they could be considered God from a certain point of view. The only one that's important to the Xenosaga games is known as Uju, which is short for Unus Mundus Drive Operator, and his desire to observe humanity in the lower domain, or specifically the lower domain universe Xenosaga exists in, is the inciting force behind a lot of parts of the series. There's obviously no equivalent of Uju in any Xenoblade game. Any gods are false ones created by the hands of man. But considering how all the way back in Xenoblade 2, in the same conversation he first mentioned the multiverse, Klaus says that his current situation might be a punishment from, quote, on high, and the idea of God existing brought up within Chapter 13 suggests that there is something like this in play with Xenoblade as well, and the conduit is also connected to the upper domain. In Xenogears, something very similar is also true, and the concept of a mortal being from the lower domain going to the upper is more or less considered ascending to walk with God, and is spoken of in a similar light to going to heaven, which may or may not become relevant when I talk about some stuff that happens later. The real meat and tatsu of the conversation here, though, is not about the upper domain, but about the specific structure of the lower. As in Xenosaga, the lower domain is split into the real number domain, which is the physical world, and the imaginary number domain, which can be grossly simplified to be described as the spirit world, but within the Saga games, it is described interchangeably as the domain of consciousness, concepts, and the soul. The collective unconscious, also known as Unus Mundus, is located in the imaginary number domain, and when someone dies, their consciousness will persist in the imaginary domain and eventually be absorbed by the collective. Additionally, the Gnosis are native to the imaginary domain, and the fact that they are non-physical entities is why they're so hard to interact with. The funny thing about that is, I described the Klein point earlier, but the other main method people in Xenosaga have for fighting the Gnosis is something known as the Hilbert effect, which you might recognize from Cosmos in Xenoblade 2. It's a special kind of field that's capable of drawing Gnosis completely into the real number domain, rendering them fully vulnerable to even conventional weaponry. You might also recognize this from Future Connected, where Shulk needed to create a concentrated ether field from his Monado Rex in order for people to be able to damage the Fog King. With the revelations from XDE, I'm not sure if we can literally say the Fog King is a Gnosis, or I guess in this case a ghost, anymore, but the principle is still the same. And honestly, given the fact that they never developed something like the Hilbert effect, I think the characters in X are doing a surprisingly good job fighting the ghosts. Yeah, the entire plot of the epilogue is fleeing them into an entirely new universe, but they're still able to hold them off and buy time pretty decently well, even though they never find a way to make them easier to hit. Another important detail is that humanity uses the imaginary number domain as a backbone to create the network known as the Unus Mundus Network, or UMN, which has a logo of an Ouroboros, by the way, because of course it does. And that is how faster-than-light travel exists in the Xenosaga universe. By using predetermined jump points located throughout Xenosaga's known space, which consists of like 500,000 planets, you can jump into the imaginary domain, travel through it a short distance, and then hop back out somewhere way further away in the universe. There's also technology known as the Encephalon, a giant virtual reality simulation that often takes the form of diving into people's memories to review events from the past to learn secrets and things like that. It is also connected to the UMN and imaginary domain, and prolonged dives into the Encephalon's virtual reality can result in real Gnosis invading the simulation because you are basically encroaching on their territory. All this UMN tech and stuff was put together because humanity had access to the Zohar and its power, and because of that, a very common theory is that the simulations used to develop the personalities of the Trinity processor were an equivalent to the Encephalon, which I think we can safely say is true given all the new information in XDE, and then also extend that to other similar things like Zanza's memory space and Origin's memory stage. And on top of that, a very popular old theory about Mira that I definitely believed at various points in time is that it was an Encephalon simulation or located in the imaginary number domain in some way. That's pretty clearly been debunked by XDE coming out, but we've now been introduced to the Rift, which is the imaginary number domain in all but name. There isn't any infrastructure within the Rift to allow you to navigate it in X, but the way Al describes using the Ares to travel between universes does sound like a higher scale version of using the UMN to warp in the Saga games. In Saga, any ship that has a license and makes it to a jump point can use that function, so you don't need any specialized technology to do that, but considering the Ares is powered by the cores, it makes sense that it would be able to do something like that on a much, much higher scale. Honestly, it's more or less directly stated that the Ares can output power similar to that of the universe being destroyed, which is kind of nuts, especially when you consider the fact that the narrative seems to be pushing an implication that the Trinity processor is on a similar level of power to those cores. While their actual place of residence is unconfirmed, the ghosts did follow the Ares to Mira with very little issue, and did so quickly that NLA discovered them before they discovered Al, so it seems like they at least have a lot of experience existing with and navigating through the Rift. People can get lost in the UMN, and the transfer network can also be used to instantly transport non-organic objects, so the idea of Volataris being a massive physical object intentionally meant to imprison one organic being, that being Void, does still align with how it's depicted in Xenosaga. I think it's very reasonable to use details about the imaginary number domain to fill out Al's explanation here, which does honestly seem like it's rushing things even more than the rest of the epilogue does. Like, he just kind of explains things, and if you're not really keyed in and popping off at the Xenoblade cameos, it ends and you're just like, okay, that's it? Did I miss something? Now what? But there is one thing that prevents me from immediately saying, this is literally the imaginary number domain, or Xenoblade equivalent thereof. And that is because Al says he observed the consciousness of all living things across all universes, and that might be a contradiction to how the multiverse is described in Xenosaga. The thing is, we don't actually know because it is very ambiguous and again, only in supplemental material that's never been officially localized. The assumption made by Xenosaga fans has always been that each individual physical universe represented by a real number domain had its own separate associated imaginary domain that contained the collective unconscious of only that real domain universe. The problem is, again, there's only one physical universe ever explored in the Saga games, which means it's impossible to tell how many imaginary domains were supposed to exist according to those games, because regardless of how many there actually are, they were only ever going to touch one. Is it possible that Xenosaga fans have been misreading diagrams since 2006? Yes. Is it possible that Xenoblade XDE just depicts a slightly different universe structure than Xenosaga? Also yes. But I think it's fun to try and reconcile them because everything else is just so one-to-one. Another parallel I definitely think is worth pointing out is that the observation terminal Udo uses to observe the imaginary domain in Saga is called Abel's Ark and looks like this. And the ships of a faction known as the Immigrant Fleet, who can trace their origins back to Earth and worship the Zohar, look like this. And riffs on both of those designs are what make up the fleet of the Samarians as imagined by Luxar in Chapter 12. Now that we know that the Samarians had their own conduit, I think we could pretty reasonably say that those parallels are going to be in more than design if we ever run into them again. Anyway, the first possibility is just that there are different depths to the imaginary domain, and in Xenosaga, no one ever delves as deep as people in Xenoblade X did. And that makes sense. Xenosaga's universe is being observed by Udo, and poking around too much in the Zohar or going too deep into the imaginary domain already can result in you getting unprotected contact with him, which tends to result in people becoming dead, missing, or insane. So maybe they just weren't able to go far enough to discover that other universes exist, and that their consciousnesses too are in the collective. Al also mentions the concept of the nexus of all universes, which looks a little bit similar to how Udo is visually depicted throughout the Saga games, and that is where, quote, the rivers of consciousness converge. You need to sync your consciousness to that thing specifically in order to safely be transferred through universes. But what exactly could he mean by the rivers of consciousness? Well, I don't think it's a particularly big jump to make to say that each river is the consciousnesses of one singular universe. In that regard, you could say the characters in Saga only explored the area of the imaginary domain that's close to their real domain, and as such, never had the possibility of discovering that other universes exist. The other possibility is that Al is actually somewhat wrong here. He did not witness the collective unconscious of every universe, but simply every universe connected by this long string of void and the ghosts destroying them. Basically, the idea is that if the ghosts go from one universe to another, and that universe collapses, its collective unconscious still needs to go somewhere, even if the associated real and imaginary domains are both destroyed, so it just kinda melds in with the collective unconscious of the next universe over and the ghost's next target, and that keeps happening until you have just one giant ball of consciousness spanning multiple universes. Is this contradicted by the fact that Al sees the other Xenoblade games? They clearly aren't connected to this chain of being destroyed by the ghosts, and he only sees one collective unconscious? Possibly, but you could probably also argue that the rift is not the imaginary domain, it is the space between universes, and from it, Al was able to see the complete and whole real and imaginary domains of many universes, including the ones of the other Xenoblade games, and then also the bloated, malformed mass of consciousnesses from multiple universes fused together that is the imaginary domain of what at that point was Mira's universe. That does seem extraordinarily convoluted though, so I'm pretty sure the most likely options by far are we were interpreting Xenosaga wrong, that's always how that worked, and that's now something they're reusing here, or this just does work slightly different from Saga. Regardless, it seems like the nexus of consciousness and the fact that everyone who ended up on Mira passed through the rift to get there is the reasoning behind why everyone can understand each other. Everyone's consciousness got added to the same flow, and even though some people are mimiosomes and some people are still controlling their original bodies, some sort of unbabylization process occurred and now everyone can understand each other. You might notice though, that this is the only mystery so far that has an explanation that isn't something specifically weird or special about Mira itself. And I'm gonna come up with several more of those when we get to the Neil Nail video, not even counting the other things I'm gonna talk about later in this one. So I do think the criticism of Mira actually isn't special at all, and all of its mystique was taken away, a little bit overblown. Now, granted, this is the payoff to the something about this planet line. Even if it is the only thing where the revelation is that it wasn't actually something about Mira at all, it is still really stupid to make the payoff not something about this planet, even if everything else is. I don't really know if something about this planet is the correct thing to say. It seems more like the planet is kind of just a planet, but there's something up with Mira's universe, though it's really just mincing words at that point because the universe seems to have the planet and very little else in it in the first place. Finally, moving on to the rest of Act 2, I think it's absolutely hilarious that Lynn talks about doing out-of-division work as if that's a weird thing, and that we haven't been dragging her all the way across Mira doing assignments that would be normally associated with every single division in Blade. I am also an extraordinarily massive fan of the fact that Gabweed shows back up here and has a new voice to dialogue. Not much else to say about that. This certainly is a Rothian-associated affinity mission with Al in it. It certainly is a little bit weird that the Rothians knew exactly who Void was, how he worked, its similarities to Mimiosomes and all of that, and just never chose to tell humanity even after becoming allied with them until it became relevant again. But hey, what do I know? I just have to keep reminding myself that a lot of exposition in this epilogue that's handled by someone who always knew this, just suddenly deciding to reveal it, would have been revealed way more organically if this story got the time to breathe. I very much wish it did. Alright, an hour and 20 minutes into the video, I think we've earned an intermission. And by intermission, I mean beach episode, because it's time to talk about Al and Lau. Quality of execution of everything else aside, I think this conversation is the one specific thing that was substantially changed from the original outline back when the Wii U version released, and that was specifically to make Lau stay dead, as a result of the tragic passing of his original Japanese voice actor, Keiji Fujiwara, who passed away in 2020 due to cancer at the age of only 55. Given how voice actors are treated in the Japanese entertainment industry, this is a pretty reasonable assumption to make, and is a completely different case from Arena, where her original Japanese VA, now Takamori, seems to have simply retired. While there is certainly an out for Lau to return in spirit form later on in the series, similar to how he does in the final battle of XDE, I think that because his character arc was complete in the original game, and it's not vital for him to return to life for the rest of the X story and any future things involving those characters going forward, the decision was made to recast him and give him a proper send-off in XDE, but then permanently retire the character afterwards as a sign of respect to Fujiwara. While I would have loved to see Lau more, and I would have absolutely been okay with the idea of him coming back to life, I think the scenes we got of him are still a perfectly good send-off for his character and are consistent with how he was portrayed in the original. I think the only reason this specific plot point is getting so much hate is that Al finding Lau on the beach was the last shot of the cliffhanger in the original game. If this was just one of the many mysteries that went unexplained and had this short of a resolution, I don't think there would be nearly as many people hating on it as there are. Anyway though, Lau being dead and the beach being a separate realm that's the border of the afterlife is another Xenosaga reference. Do you see what I mean? Where this is extraordinarily disjointed and hard to understand for anyone not familiar with Xenosaga. From what I've seen, there are two reactions for someone who hasn't played Saga. It's either popping off like, oh, what does all this mean? This is so cool and interesting, but I don't understand any of it. And then on the other side, there are people who are able to tell that this is clearly a reference to another Xeno game, but don't have the context to understand exactly what it is, so it just seems like multiple times throughout the epilogue, they interrupt the plot of Xenoblade X to shove exposition from a different game down your throat and still don't adequately explain any of it. Meanwhile, people who have played Saga are just like, yup, they sure are doing that, but again, and it's not particularly exciting. Anyway though, this is a Xenoblade equivalent to the Beach of Nothingness from Xenosaga, which is a realm described as similar to Limbo or Purgatory, where those who are alive can go to interact with the dead. Shion Uzuki, the main character of the Xenosaga series, visits this beach 2 different times, once in the first game and once in the third game. One of these times, she's speaking to someone who's either on the brink of death or just died, while the other time she's talking to someone who's been deceased for a very long time. And in that case, it seems like the implication is that this is where people end up after they die, but before they're ready to join the collective unconscious. The person who just died that Xian interacts with describes the beach this way. Xian, I like it here. I'm the only living thing that exists in this place. There's nothing else. No anger, no sadness, no happiness, not even a future. The only thing that's here is me, and that'll eventually fade away. It feels good. This is exactly what I've been searching for all this time. Xian, you'll eventually find yourself here too. I'm sure of it. This is, of course, a close equivalent to the speech Lao gives to Al when they have their conversation in the Xenoblade X version of the beach. And afterwards, we even see Lao consumed by a flow of golden light motes a la Xenoblade 3, something that shows up to accept him after he says he's going to reunite with his deceased wife and daughter, and the exact same flow that shows up in the final battle, also bringing with it the souls of other people of Earth, right after the Ares hits its best Ouroboros pose. While it is ultimately something coming from another Xenoblade game, it's nice to at least say something isn't just Saga again. Given how they only show us this imagery in X after they've already shown us the connection to the numbered games, I think the comparisons are intentional, and these light motes mean the same thing they do in Xenoblade 3, especially because Lao is associated with golden light motes, the same color that soldiers who reach their homecoming age and citizens who were never tied to flame clocks at all give off when they die. It's the motes of those who are not bound to the cycle, and it's unknown where people who die in such a way pass to after they leave Ionios. Though at least within that system they are able to return in some way because N and M's regret were able to incarnate Noah and Mia one more time. The thing is, while we don't know exactly how it works, it is confirmed that the souls of citizens, the new life created within Ionios, are stored in Origin as well. So I think we can take the comparisons between Origin and the Lifehold one step further now. They're not equivalents to each other, they are both artificial recreations of the collective unconscious that exists within the Rift. As far as the Lifehold's concerned, we're more or less directly told that within the Epilogue. The structure of the Lifehold resembles the collective unconscious so much that when the White Whale passed through the Rift, everyone got backed up to the collective unconscious as well, which is how they're able to continue to exist, piloting their mimeosomes using their souls in the Rift, even after the core was damaged. And it's also almost certain that the design of the Lifehold core was influenced by Ares technology, just like all of humanity's advanced technology on Earth was. The Ares is a vessel for sentient life that seems to be able to pull on consciousnesses within the Rift for power, and was developed by Samar, a society that had access to the conduit, and was clearly intimately familiar enough with the Rift to be able to stick Volataris in there indefinitely. And, well, people have been drawing comparisons between the Lifehold and Origin ever since Xenoblade 3 first came out. Given how Mobius formed within Origin because of the collective thoughts of people within it, given how Zed and Void's true form seem to be very similar to each other, and the two characters more or less act as two sides of the same coin, and how Chapter 13 is thematically the B-side to Xenoblade 3 as a whole, having the major theme of death as opposed to Xenoblade 3's theme of life, it all just kinda clicks together here. On top of that, Origin's entire structure is based on the Ontos Trinity Core, and like I said before, the Trinity cores and the Ares cores seem to be being put on the same level as things that can replicate the power of the conduit when used properly. In 3's case, the golden motes signify that someone is not part of the cycle, but that their soul is still stored in Origin and doesn't completely leave that closed system. While here, it instead indicates that Lao is joining the full flow of the collective unconscious. So it is literally just the same thing, but on different scales, and presumably now that the intersection's been resolved and everything's merged safely, Origin is no longer needed, and anyone who dies on that new planet will just join the greater multiversal flow in the Rift like everyone else. Though I'm guessing Origin is still around to some degree, just so that the souls of everyone who was born in Ionios have somewhere to exist before they're reincarnated on that new world. considering Al likens the Beach of Nothingness to Nirvana, I'm gonna say gold motes happening to you when you die is explicitly a good thing. Also, while some people take some of Al's other dialogue to indicate inconsistencies where he acts as if he's always been a member of Blade or Blade was formed before humanity landed on Mira, and that is almost exclusively people just blatantly misunderstanding dialogue, the one case of a weird contradiction is in this scene where Al's coat says Blade on it, despite the fact that he hadn't been to Mira yet. This absolutely does make no sense, and the reason it is like this is because that jacket is something you can just wear as a piece of equipment in the game, and they didn't feel like making an alternate version of it where they painted over that one portion of the texture to get rid of the logo. It's stupid, but I get why they didn't do anything about it. Now, obviously, in-universe, humans on the White Whale could have gotten one of these coats, and it just wouldn't have the Blade logo on it. Then new ones made after landing on Mira for Blade operatives would have the logo added to it. So it's only the fact that Al has the Blade version of the outfit in this scene that's wrong. I also don't know how he got this outfit. I guess there was just a compartment in the Ares that stored one of these coats, and he chose to wear it when he went to the beach for whatever reason. Maybe it was colder than it looks. Lau's nipples are not rendered in high enough resolution to tell how he's responding to the temperature there while shirtless, but I think it would be absolutely hilarious if future Xenoblade games involve traveling through the rifts to other universes, or worlds one might even say, and it becomes common practice to wear a modified version of one of those coats that Al has, just for the purpose of surviving the rift trip properly, and we just get the organization cloak again. People would hate it, but I would laugh, and that's what really matters. As for the second encounter with Void, I don't really have much to say other than Cassandra Lee Mars continues to impress with her performance as Lynn. I don't know, this is where we start kind of seeing the really cringe side of Void, where he does genuinely just sound like a Redditor who thinks he's smarter than he is. Like, maybe he was imprisoned in the Rift, not for his conduit experimentation, but just because he was so cringe. It really is a shame that Liesel, who directly mentions the phrase, "Am I the asshole?" and HB, who is by far the most Reddit-coded Xenoblade character of all time, don't have any direct interactions with Void. Next important scene is back in the hangar where Al discusses the cores again. I've talked a lot about the Ares' history on Elma's planet earlier, so we can be pretty brief this time. Before that, though, I would like to say that I think other character wants to be part of the How's It Poppin' gag and get screwed over by Al flipping the script on them is one of the funniest implementations of the joke. And the fact that Gwyn's character completely changes from just some guy who's pretty boring to even more pathetic than he was before, and the ultimate Al Glazer, despite meeting him for the first time on screen within this chapter, and basically never actually getting acknowledged by the man himself, should make me really mad because he got flanderized and his personality changed completely, but ultimately he was changed from an extremely sauceless version of Rhine to Alan Ridgely 2, which is a strict improvement, and he clearly got the better end of the stick than L did. Also, how are people actually annoyed with the amount people are glazing Al? Like, he's not a Gary Stu in any way. He hates being seen as the hero, gets annoyed when most people try to talk him up as one, stands aside to let other characters, especially Elma, do things they're better than him at, loses to Void twice on screen, and almost the entirety of Act 3 is him being a damsel in distress. And even after he's rescued, he sits us down in the cockpit of the Ares to beat Void because he couldn't have done it himself. He's talked up and mythologized even more in the base game than he is in the epilogue. And hey, guess what? The entire point of him being talked up that way is to subvert it with the fact that he is literally just some guy, and even with all those accomplishments and accolades, he still gets destroyed by the new antagonist, who we are able to beat using the same skill that he usually uses. I really don't understand how people keep saying that other characters are sidelined to build up Al, when besides like the closing narration, Elma gets the majority of big speeches, including the massive Xeno protagonist one about the future. Lynn still gets the majority of big character beats and moments, and has the biggest effect on other people, and then Cross still gets to do all the cool things, not just in the final boss fight, but in the cutscene afterwards. Al's over here sitting in a chair trying to tell the Ares to lock in, while we're doing things he could only do with the Ares without it, and yet he's the main focus of everything, and the only important character, apparently. Anyway, though, this cutscene is the one where he says the Ares cores were based on some kind of quote-unquote meta doohickey. And we do find out in the final cutscene that it is in fact the Samarians' conduit. This is a clear analog to the concept of Zohar emulators, which until now have only existed in any form within Xenosaga. They're more or less exactly what the name implies. Human-made devices designed to emulate the power and functions of the original Zohar, though they're nowhere near as powerful. The biggest difference is that the emulators in Saga are the same size and shape of the Zohar. There are 12 primary ones and one additional one that was made using spare parts, whereas XDE's Ares cores number only 6, and look a lot like, but not identically, to an Ouroboros or Mobius core from Xenoblade 3, while being at least a little bigger looking than them. I want to say about the size of a beach ball. I've seen a small amount of confusion out there as to what the cores actually are. Some people seem to think they are, as I laid out, an equivalent to Zohar emulators, but with the conduit, and some people think it is literally the Samarian conduit split into 6. I understand the confusion because in the final cutscene, Al says that Void distilled the conduit's power into the 6 cores, which can very easily be interpreted as him physically carving these things out of the giant monolith, but going back to this conversation in Act 2, he specifically says they were based on the meta doohickey, so they are artificial recreations. It might seem a little weird that someone could create even a weaker version of the conduit, but you do have to keep in mind, this is Void, the greatest mind of the Samarians we're talking about, and it really seems to be implied that the Samarians had their conduit for way longer when Void did his thing than the numbered games humanity had theirs before Klaus screwed everything up. Even in Xenosaga, the process of making Zohar emulators is pretty hand-waved, but it is described as just being a thing with waves. If you remember how I described the upper domain as having a lot of energy in it, and the beings inside it being known as wave existences, the Xenosaga Zohar's power is described in terms of giving off different wavelengths, and the method by which the Zohar emulators were created was by observing ancient relics also powered by the Zohar, and emulating those wavelengths. The conduit isn't nearly as well explained as Saga Zohar is, so we can't say that's the same method Void used to craft the Ares cores, but the Samarians are also by far the most technologically advanced civilization in the entire Xeno series, that is, including Saga's humanity, so it makes sense that they would be able to create something similar to the Zohar emulators, with something similar to the Zohar to base off of, and was able to make them much smaller than Saga's emulators, as in 6 of them can be mounted on a single normal-sized Skell small. There's also the very distinct possibility that the 6 cores combined are one Zohar emulator equivalent, because we never see them separated and they're never discussed as anything more than a unit of all 6. From the opposite perspective, 6 Ares cores plus 6 Ouroboros cores equal 12, and while that is not the number of Zohar emulators in Xenosaga, that is the number of Vessels of Anima in those games, and the number of Anima relics in Xenogears. Those are equivalent to each other across those games, but have never appeared in any equivalent form in Xenoblade, and in both cases can be aligned with a mech to power it up dramatically. Ion and the Ares Prime are the closest equivalents to anything like that in Blade, so you could maybe say that is another thing the cores are a reference to. I don't really have a lot to analyze about Al getting melded with the Ares. It just kind of makes sense as a thing that would happen and isn't any big specific reference to anything else in the Xeno series. It's just more of a general sci-fi and mecha trope. And yeah, his mind got melded with Void's when they were stuck in the rift together. That also makes sense. Like, they're in the rift next to the nexus of human consciousness. So yeah, they might have been tugged by that a little bit and mixed with each other in that way. There's not really a lot to analyze here. It's just things that happen that Al tells us about. I guess he does give a little bit more evidence to my theory that there are universes with their own singular collective unconscious that converge together into the big multiversal nexus, because the way Al describes it is that each stream converging is similar in structure to the Lifehold core, and not the entire nexus being similar to it, but we might just be arguing semantics here. They talk around it for some reason, but they do also directly confirm here and now that humans are piloting their mimeosomes while their consciousness and soul are in the rift, as Al directly says that he felt, quote, "you guys, people's lives," end quote, while he was there, which is yet another extremely Xenoblade 3 thing to say. And right after that, he does also directly say that the Ares can tap into that power, so if you had any reservations about it being basically an Ouroboros, they should have been gotten rid of right there. The only difference is that, based on what we know, the Ares with its cores, or at least whatever state it was in the final battle, is more powerful than even all the Ouroboros combined, because Ouroboros could only draw on the power of people in Origin, and even then, only people whose wills weren't contributing to Mobius's power, while the Ares can directly delve into the rift itself, and draw on the power of anyone who died while it was active. Remember, Arena's brother Leon was one of the souls that powered up the Ares in the final battle, and he died on Earth before it was destroyed. So he was killed before Earth's universe died, and was still picked up by the Ares. And Lao was also picked up, despite accepting his death, willingly joining the big flow of consciousness, and having died on Mira prior to Al getting there. It just seems like the Ares has a much wider range of souls that can power it up than the Ouroboros could, and that's if Ouroboros can even function at all in the combined world post the ending of Ionios, so it really seems like X massively leapfrogged the trilogy in terms of power levels here, and I could pretty comfortably argue that Void is the most powerful final boss in the entire Blade series so far. So yeah, the trilogy characters are going to be the ones on the back foot if they meet the X-Cast anytime soon. You might have been wondering why I haven't talked about the Universal Nexus point a whole lot, and that's just because it's something brand new to XDE. There's no analog to it in any previous Xeno game, even the other Blade ones, so I know exactly as much about it as you do, and that means I don't really have anything else to say. I guess it makes sense that there's some sort of frequency you need to align to get from one universe to another, even if the rift is just the space between them. I already talked about the flashback scene, so I don't have too much to discuss regarding Elma and Al's conversation after all this, but I do think it's a very good character beat for both of them, and shows that Al is probably anticipating that he's not going to make it out of this, and honestly, he probably wouldn't have if Cross wasn't just built different in the final battle. Skipping the grand reveal of the White Whale 2 until the end of the act, when we could just talk about everything regarding it at the same time, we have the Amomo section and the Ted section, which really do feel like separate affinity missions that probably would have been required for an extended version of the story, but were just folded into the actual Act 2. The Amomo section is my favorite written part of this entire epilogue, and to me is an example of the thing that makes Xenoblade X's writing and storytelling so special. Grounded, self-contained character stories that, even if the situation is unrealistic, the feelings and the thought processes behind everyone is. Amomo might genuinely be my favorite non-party member character in the entire game now. These small stories are representative of one of my favorite tropes in media, period. And that is when minor characters who are insignificant in the grand scheme of things are the ones spouting philosophy that directly disproves the antagonist's entire worldview. Both of the characters these sections focus on have completely different relationships with death than what Void assumes all sentient life has. Amomo views it almost as a friend and is completely willing to accept it because she feels her time has come. Similar to Lao, she is okay with passing away because she knows it will mean she'll be reunited with those who've passed on before her. Before Lin changes her mind, she is more emotionally tied to this home she built with her husband than her own life, and this intertwines with Al's idea of finding your own place. This place is where she felt the most at home, and with Mira gone, it would never be able to exist in the same way again, and that being destroyed would take so much of her with it that she might as well be dead anyway. It takes Lin reminding her that A, she's not a burden, so that line of thought was just factually incorrect anyway, and B, her not coming on the White Whale 2 would have a massive adverse effect on many other people, much greater than the effect losing her home would have just on herself. If the spirits of those who have passed on live on through those they influenced in life, then yeah, the longer you're around those people, the stronger an influence you'll have on them, and the more you will be able to exist in this world even after you've departed it. Then at the end of this section, we're reminded that Lyn is actually the real protagonist of Xenoblade X, because she is the one with the special power to draw people together and strengthen everyone's will to live. Then, after that, Al talks to Lyn and directly lays out everything I've been saying to her, because exposition in this epilogue sure is a thing. But I digress, and we move on. I feel like I should have more to say about the Ted section, because, honestly, he is probably the most relatable character to a lot of people who are big fans of X and don't like how the epilogue is completely ditching Mira. But unlike the Amomo section, this does have a massive gameplay portion, which is literally just busy work going around several places in the overworld and then listening to a small cutscene, which when combined with double exposition for things that don't need it and barely any exposition for things that do, really brings to mind the worst of FF14 patch MSQ, and is especially egregious because this came out about the same time 7.2 did, which, as far as I know, almost completely fixed those issues on 14's side. The big thing is, yes, it is confirmed and unmissable that the White Whale 2 is bringing genetic information from the creatures of Mira, so that means that we're not completely saying goodbye to the enemies of Xenoblade X. And I have to tell you, that is something I'm very, very happy about. The trilogy, while it does add a few new species each game, and the antagonist faction and most humanoid enemies are completely different, the bestiary is almost the same as it was in Xenoblade 1 back in 2010, with the Switch versions of all three games basically just using the same models each time. I would absolutely take another game just reusing the existing X enemies over a fourth run-through of the Xenoblade 1 enemy list. And also, I think the enemies are some of the most iconic parts of X, which is not something you can really say about the trilogy. Like, yeah, Bonnets and Armus are iconic, but I would say some of Mira's indigens are as iconic as some of Mira's landscape shots, which is absolutely not something you can say about the other games, and is even more important because Mira's landscape shots are the most impressive and iconic in the series. Either way, this is more evidence for my agenda that X2 is going to exist, and is going to be a soft reboot of the entire Xenoblade X concept, where you have the same characters, you have a lot of the same enemies, you have mostly the same premise, but it's just on a different planet. What I don't understand is why Tatsu had to be the one to suggest bringing Miran genetic data on the White Whale 2. This is not a slight against Tatsu in any way, I just don't know how such negligence got so far down the chain of command that Tatsu was the first person to suggest doing this. I don't get how you could start doing a second Project Exodus, one that's encompassing more sentient races than the original one did, and not think to take more animals than the original one did as well. It's really dumb and is just kind of a contrivance so that the TED section can exist. And I don't know if this section hit well enough for the people who it was probably aimed at to justify making everyone seem this incompetent. Also, Al is racist to Tatsu here. I don't have a comment on that part, but he does say Napon instead of Nopon. Now, this is probably just the same mistake that led to it being pronounced Sylvalum for no reason in the epilogue, but it is Al specifically getting this wrong, and I do believe at least Elma does correctly say it as Nopon elsewhere in the epilogue, so you can justify this. We never directly see Al get taught the names of the different races present on Mira, and that means that maybe he didn't learn the name Nopon from a Miran Nopon. If we assume he did actually look into the worlds of the other Xenoblade games while he was in the Rift, he would have seen that those worlds have Napon in them. That would have been his first introduction to them. And they're pronounced Napon in those other worlds. So when he gets to Mira, he sees Tatsu, he's probably just like, hey, I guess they have Napon here too, and no one ever bothers to correct him, and he never picks up on saying Nopon because the other way is the way he learned it first. Can you tell that I'm drawing some parallels with myself here? This is one of those things that literally doesn't matter at all because it's pronounced the same in Japanese in all games, but Elma's Xenoblade 2 DLC content included a joke about how Napon versus Nopon is pronounced differently between Allrest and Mira, so I would not be surprised at all that if Al ever eventually shows up in a game with numbered Xenoblade characters, they're going to lampshade this as well. Is it even safe for him to do that though? I don't know. I absolutely want X characters to cross over with people from the rest of the series, but I don't know if it's a good idea for Al and Rex to ever meet. Al is Lynn's cool uncle, and the only reason it's okay to have him and Lao, the dad character, in the same room is because Lao is depressed and not upbeat and fun most of the time. If you put Al, the cool uncle, and Rex, the cool dad, in the room at the same time, nothing will ever get done again besides an ungodly amount of grilling. The only thing that'll keep the characters on the White Whale 2 safe is if they just stop using the Ares now that they're in the new universe. If Al and Rex meet, the Ares will be turned into a giant grill, and that will be the end of everything. The most important part of the Ted section, though, comes at the very end, where he claims that he heard the beings who made Mira tell him that to preserve is to cultivate. Ordinarily, I'd probably view this as some kind of throwaway line, but these beings seem to exist. You can either say you heard the voices too, to which Lynn will say she didn't hear it but it's a nice notion, or say that Ted is hallucinating. If you say the latter, Elmo will step in and criticize you, saying it makes sense that the world would speak to Ted given how much he's been dedicating himself to it. So yeah, if Elma thinks so, even in the "you're probably crazy" dialogue option, I think we can pretty reasonably say that the beings who created Mira are out there. And if they're out there, that means they can be encountered in a later game and give us more information on the mysteries of Mira that were not explained in this one. Who could these beings actually be, though? Well, given everything else in the epilogue, I think the most obvious answer is some sort of subset of Samarians. Given that the Samarians seem to be a very advanced, somewhat peaceful, and enlightened, for lack of a better term, race who completely removed the death penalty from their society, I could see at least some subset of them wanting to preserve life, especially preserving life from universes that are in danger by the ghosts because of Void, because of one of their own's actions. I'm going to assume not every Samarian has the power to directly talk to people that say anything on Mira like Void did, but maybe they have some other way to gain heightened awareness and were able to sense what Ted was putting into Mira in his love for the planet and its creatures. The other option, and another one that makes sense with them being able to speak to Ted kind of out of nowhere like this, is that there's some sort of higher being, like a wave existence Udu type character, from whatever they're going to end up calling the upper domain in the Xenoblade games. I don't think it's very responsible to speak about these beings anymore, given that there's one conversation that mentions them and it's extremely ambiguous as to whether or not they actually exist, but this even being a possibility is extremely exciting for me and expands the Xeno multiverse in an even greater way than just having a game dealing with the Xeno multiverse in the first place did. My theory about Mira being a preserve obviously didn't become true in practice, and even this conversation is barely enough to call it coming true in spirit, but I'm at least glad the developers had a similar thought process regarding Mira to me, because I think conservation of nature and protecting endangered species is very important in the real world, and I like when the video games I play reinforce my worldview. Nothing more complex than that. There are a lot of things I theorized that came true in this epilogue, and there are definitely bigger things that made me happier to see, but this is the thing that made me feel the most cozy, if that makes sense. Alright, let's quickly talk about the White Whale 2 before we close out this act. The first thing I think we need to mention is the size of things. Or rather, first we have to talk about the absolute America moment, that is, collaborating with the Manon on the second Exodus project, gaining use of one of their ships for it, and then rechristening that ship after a defunct American ship and nothing that had to do with the Manon themselves. Absolutely bang up job, Maurice. You might be French, but I guess you have the American spirit in you too. The first actual thing we need to talk about is the size of things. No, the White Whale 2 being so much smaller than the White Whale 1 is not a plot hole. Yeah, it's even smaller than the city of NLA, well, that was just one small part of the giant original ship, but you have to remember, as massive as X's world is, nothing in the game is its actual size in canon. Not only is NLA much larger canonically than it appears in game, but so is the Manon ship. You also have to keep in mind, NLA, in another America moment, is very, very poorly designed and makes terrible use of its space. Why is the residential district a suburb when you could have just made one big apartment building and made the entire residential unit smaller while being able to fit even more people living in it. The Manon ship isn't trying to do any of that. From the best we could tell, Manon live in small pods on their own, and then it's also just being used as a lifeboat, cramming as many people and resources on as possible, so it's not like luxury and personal space are going to be at a premium to begin with. There's also the differing technology levels to keep in mind. Manon technology, while not quite as advanced as that of the Samarians, is still light years ahead of humanity, even with the bump from having the Ares to base things off of. I think it's safe to say the Manon were somehow able to solve the problem real-world rocketry's been suffering with since it was created, which is the biggest part of any ship is the fuel, because you need fuel to get anywhere, and then you also need fuel to carry that other fuel. There's also the very morbid fact that basically every race's population has only decreased since getting to Mira, so it's possible that there are a lot of buildings in NLA that just didn't have anyone in them in the first place. Unless I'm mistaken, none of the quests that involve other races moving to the city bring up a potential housing crisis from adding that many new people, so I am inclined to believe that. Then lastly, the original Exodus plan was predicated on the idea that an ARC ship would be spending an indefinite time in space before finding a suitable planet to land on, while it seems like the second project was much more slapdash and built on hope, and the plan legitimately seems to be, we will get to another universe, and if the Ares is helping us out, we will pop out at a suitable planet, like actually ended up happening. But even without that happening, the Manon ship is much faster and more efficient, so it can scour space for such a planet a lot better than the original Whale could, which means that a lot less resources would need to be loaded on the ship, because its total time in space would almost certainly be less than the 2 years the original Whale was. Granted, fandom does say the White Whale 2 is now, quote, capable of withstanding even the longest voyage, end quote, but I don't know, maybe Manon also have hyper-advanced hydroponics technology that would allow growing food so much easier too. Another important thing that people seem to miss is that, yes, the White Whale 2 is still carrying all the records of humanity that the White Whale 1 had. At the beginning of Act 2, Vandam directly says they're going to incorporate the Lifehold Core's protoplasmic fluid system into the White Whale 2. That means they can use it to generate more organic life wherever they end up, which is why it's not completely pointless to gather the genetic data from all the creatures of Mira. It's also clearly visible that the White Whale 2 is carrying the Zohar-shaped databases that were also part of the Lifehold system, you know, the kind that Gawadia destroys one of in Chapter 4 and you can encounter several other times throughout the game. There are less of those Lifehold units on the White Whale 2 than are around the core, but you have to remember, any good system like that would keep redundant backups. So I think it's pretty likely that given that and the fact that the Manon probably have their own extremely good computers, at least one copy of all the preserved Lifehold data is still making it onto the White Whale 2. Keep in mind, this includes genetic data from the original Lifehold core. The only part of that that was destroyed was the part housing everyone's consciousnesses. So yes, they can recreate organic life, including stuff from Earth. Honestly, given the state of backups and redundant systems, I don't think any data from the Lifehold units destroyed during the game was ever permanently lost. The White Whale 2 not only carries the legacy of humanity and of planet Earth, but also the legacy built by Blade and its allies on Mira. That will be carried to a new planet, and the spirit of Mira does still survive in everyone who once called her home. The last cutscene of Act 2 is also noticeable because it has 2 out of the 3 instances of actually funny content regarding L that is new in Definitive Edition. The first one is him just shouting pants off to you, which I think would be funny no matter who said it, and the second one is while he's reassuring Lynn, because he doesn't just butcher a normal phrase in English, he butchers a phrase in English that Alvis used to great effect at the end of the original Xenoblade, creating a very cursed version of some of the most iconic words ever spoken in the series. As for the third thing, it's Neil Nail stealing his bit in a post-battle dialogue, and that's not even something we can actually credit to L. Neil Nail styling on L and proving that she is peak made the top 3 funniest L moments. That's how dire it is. Al brings up that he and Void's minds got mixed up while in the Rift here, and I'm going to defend him not giving the full explanation he does in narration at the end of the game, because none of it is actually relevant to the current situation. While a bunch of Chapter 13's exposition is handled by a character who allegedly knew this the entire time, explaining it even though it would have been useful before just because it's plot relevant now. I don't think Void's exact origins are particularly necessary to the second Project Exodus plan, especially after the characters had just tried to empathize with him and completely failed to do so. They would not care at all. The only reason we do investigation into Samar during Act 3 is because the lore drops happened to be there and we needed to explore Volataris to get the spears and recover all our party members anyway. Speaking of Act 3 though, this is the end of Act 2, so we can now move on to analyzing the endgame. My thoughts on basically the entire beginning of Act 3 can be summed up with, this is cool to look at, and would be great from a story perspective too, if it didn't happen way too quickly here. I want to say the Bridge of the White Whale 2 reminds me of something specific, but I really can't put a finger on it. I guess it vaguely looks like the bridges of a lot of ships in Saga, but I don't think that's close enough to call a reference, so I'm probably just thinking of commonly reused sci-fi and mecha tropes again. Really, at this point in the story, given its goal and its passengers, the White Whale 2 is most like the Enterprise out of any famous sci-fi ships, but even then it doesn't look like it at all, so I think I'm just imagining things here. Anyway, the actual big battle in the city cutscene is really cool. I love seeing grunt skells piloted by characters we will never learn the names of actually pop off and hold their own against the ghosts. And the fact that there's multiple scenes with this level of production value and high quality cool mecha choreography is genuinely impressive. Since the original 2, Xenoblade's kind of made a name for itself for having cool, high choreographed, well-animated melee fights between a few characters, but even in 2 and 3, most of the large-scale battle scenes are not to this scale and this kinetic, and outside the final battle of 3, you never see mechanical animation that's this impressive. And the fact that they do it twice just within the epilogue, when there are really only 2 scenes remotely near this level in the original game, is something that needs to be applauded, and I cannot wait for the next X-style game to do more of this kind of thing. On the flip side, these people running so slowly is really funny. Like, this looks like a scene where you'd see a few people get turned to salt as an example of what happens to the people who don't get away in time, and then we go in to save who we can, but they forgot to have anyone actually get killed, so these people are just lightly jogging and still managing to escape the ghosts, who we see flying at what has to be supersonic speeds right before that shot plays. Now's as good a time as any to mention that in addition to being associated with the Book of Revelation, all the ghost enemies have religious-themed names as well. Pilgrim, Acolyte, Crusader, and Cathedral are pretty self-explanatory. Pale Rider is a reference to Death, the fourth horseman of the Apocalypse, which is very fitting for what the ghosts are. And Megatherion is Greek for Great Beast, of which there are 3 in the Book of Revelation. Even the new super bosses get in on this too. I don't think I need to explain Apocalypsis the Sacrificant, and the second one is Glossolalia the Allochthon. The first of those words is just a fancy term for what's commonly known as speaking in tongues, and an Allochthon is a geographic formation that's somewhat analogous to Rennes-le-Château from Xenosaga 3, but perhaps more importantly translates directly from Greek to English as Other Earth, so, you know, basically a synonym for the Greek words that Xeno came from, and is a hint that the ghosts might be connected to humanity in some way, or that Samarians are an equivalent to humans from another universe. In the next scene, even with the lack of real good build-up, Lynn saying "there it goes" to NLA finally falling still hits me pretty hard, because like, yeah, that is home. That is something I've called home for 10 years going up in flames. And I do think it's another nice piece of subtle characterization for Cross that they hang and look at the city for a bit longer than everyone else. Most people here are from Earth. They've lost that planet, and now they're losing Mira. Elma's losing her home for the 3rd time. Al as well, if you're counting him having to flee his country to come to America. And while El has never left Mira, he at least lived somewhere else prior to NLA, so this would probably still be considered his second home. But Cross? They have amnesia. New Los Angeles is the only home they can remember, and it's getting destroyed right in front of them, with absolutely nothing they or anyone else can do but continue to flee. They are feeling the pain of losing everything for the first time. You want to know something that's absolutely cool? Bringing in everyone to form the final raiding party. Yeah, it is kind of weird that the Clurians, Liesel, and Mia are missing, especially because Tatsu's given his own slot in the formation, which means if they wanted to add one more row, there are exactly enough slots to add all 4 of those. But I think it is really cool to acknowledge that, yeah, the main characters of the story aren't the only important members of Blade who are putting in work. yeah, we only get to see the slice of everyone else's careers that we ourselves participate in, and the missions of ours that we bring them on, but I like the idea that, yeah, this is a larger world than you know. And while, yeah, you could see the silhouettes of characters you haven't unlocked on the party select screen, it's really neat to just show them. The 4 DLC characters from the original game show up in Chapter 12 cutscenes, but here it's almost every optional character. And I think that could be really cool for someone who didn't do a lot of side content, because here's a character design. What if you see someone you've never noticed in the game so far, think their design is cool, and now have to go try and figure out how to unlock them after you finish the chapter? This, on top of the fact that all of the characters are interactable outside in Volataris, and they all have new voice-acted content, is what shows to me that the complaints about no one who worked on the epilogue caring about X, and them just wanting to get this out of the way, are false. There is clearly a lot of love for Xenoblade X and its characters in here, and I find it very, very hard to believe they'd get all of the VAs possible back for just one cutscene apiece in most cases. I am pretty confident we will be seeing these characters again, and probably sooner rather than later. And even if they're missing from this scene, the other 4 characters do still have a Volataris conversation, so even Mia has new voiced dialogue. Getting some free money from Vandom, still having access to Frontier Nav, and having all the NLA shops in the White Whale 2 is good, but it was a massive oversight to not also include L's shop somewhere if you've unlocked it, because it's still possible to work on augments. You could even do some squad tasks if they ask for ganglion enemies that appear in Volataris, and you can get division bonuses, but you're not able to make slots to put them in, so good luck actually making any new gear you get in Volataris better than what you already have, even if numerically it is an upgrade. Most of the dialogue when talking to the other characters before you start the mission is pretty generic. Gwyn sure is Alan Ridgely now. Nagi, however, is the exception because he is just a radical dude like that. "I, Kentaro Nagi, am now but another blade," is one of the rawest lines in a game that has no trouble coming up with them. And I honestly really like learning that he goes by Ken among his friends, especially because there's a little bit of implication that he either trained Al or trained alongside Al, given that they use the same melee weapon, and Elma's Xenoblade 2 appearances where she was very clearly alluding to Al mentioned that he was a fan of cherry blossoms and possibly Japan as a whole, so it would make sense if they knew each other to at least some degree before Project Exodus. Also, if the next X game is a direct sequel to this one, and we're still playing as an Avatar character who is supposed to be the same one from this game, Nagi's name better be Ken in the party list and anywhere else in the UI. I get why they didn't change it here, but it would be really cool if they did it in a sequel. Moving on to Elma's big speech. No, they didn't momentarily forget while they were writing, or retcon, the fact that Blade was formed after humanity made it to Mira and after Al was lost. I don't know how people are misreading this very simple concept to understand, and then whining about how the writers didn't care. Al says that Elma made Blade, the organization he is currently acting as part of after he arrived on Mira, what it is today, the present day, which he is there for and able to witness. He was not there for the formation of Blade, or it getting to the point where it is today. Hence why he is saying Elma is the one who made it what it is today, and giving the floor to her to make the heroic speech, because it will mean more coming from her, the person who all the members of Blade are familiar with, have directly worked with, and look up to. Al more or less looks directly into the camera, says that Elma is the reason all of the characters of the game have done so much in the 12 chapters plus side content up until now, and that because of that, she is the one who deserves to make the big motivational speech to everyone before the final battle, the likes of which are almost exclusively reserved for the main character in any Xeno game, and people still think he upstages everyone and is the only one who gets to do things in the epilogue. I am almost certain Al specifically using the words, "It's your voice they gotta hear," was intentional. Your Voice, the name of the ending theme of the original game. A song sung in duet between a man and a woman. There are several songs like that on the soundtrack, and if you go back to the lyrics of ones that didn't make sense before, you'll see that a lot of those are probably just about Elma and Al. The speech itself I also think is very good. It's a bit more characterization for Elma, and I like a few small notions that are present there. Elma brings up the concept of Mother Earth, of loving the planet as one would a close family member, which is neat not just because it's actually a reference to something real human cultures across the planet have been doing for thousands of years, but also because it implies that Elma's culture did not do such a thing with their own home planet. If her people cared half as much about her planet as we do Earth, she absolutely would have brought it up during one of her exposition scenes in the epilogue, but she doesn't. There's also the best possible capstone for X's transhumanist themes that they could probably possibly hope to fit in something this compressed. There's a lot of talk about whether or not the Earthlings are even still human in their MIMS, and there's existential crises and things like that about that. But with the additional knowledge Al was able to provide, she comes to the realization that, yes, no matter what you are on the outside, all sentient life is the same, and is powered by the same spirit, the same will to keep progressing forward, and the same soul that will touch others throughout your life, and reunite with everyone else in the collective unconscious after death. If all the cool super robot stuff about the Ares Prime wasn't a big enough indicator, the thing that Elma came to love the most about Earth is literally the indomitable human spirit, and she motivates all of humanity by reminding them that they still have that, be they in a flesh and blood body or a MIM. It is that makes you human, and it is that makes humanity special, as they're capable of igniting a similar fire in all the xenoforms they come across too. There's a lot of emphasis placed on specifically demarcating sentient from non-sentient life throughout the epilogue, and when combined with people realizing the soul exists during XDE, having figured it out off-screen in the numbered games, and with Elma's talk about perfecting the soul and reaching enlightenment, I think this is something that's going to show up in the future as well, especially because there are a lot of characters who are artificial creations, but still seem to be fully sentient and possess a soul. Yelv was not explained in this. There's no way he was ever going to be explained in this. He's an optional character who is DLC in the Japanese version of the original X. But either way, he was presumably created by Eleonora and has false memories, but he has a soul. The original Ganglion were created by Void, and the Zarubagans were created by the Ganglion. So that's a 3-layer thing, and Zarubagans clearly are sentient and have souls. So I think an important thing that will be touched on in the future, especially if the Samarians show up again, is going to be what that spark that grants you sentience, that grants you a soul is. I don't think anyone in Xenoblade 2 is able to figure out how Poppy is sentient despite being an artificial blade, but she is, and she does clearly have a soul. Honestly, little hints like this are the things from the epilogue that make me the most excited, because it's not like they are only importing Saga lore wholesale, they're also dropping little hints for ways they could advance our knowledge past what Saga provided in the future. The furthest Saga ever got on this front was saying that yes, artificial beings do have souls and exist in the collective unconscious, and even that was only a couple paragraphs in a Japan-exclusive guidebook. So X has already advanced past there, and didn't even need to go out and say that kind of thing because it was already implicit in the original text, and emphasized further here in DE. While the new universe they make it to at the end of the epilogue clearly has been around for a while if it has a planet, so they're not directly paralleling the Samarians by arriving at the dawn of time, the idea of enlightened humans who've transcended their flesh showing up in a new universe is very exciting for a lot of reasons, both plot and philosophical, and I'm very interested to see what they do with the White Whale 2 going forward. The big downside to these scenes is, of course, the fact that a lot of it appears to be pre-rendered, so you don't get any scale customization, and everyone gets lumped into one of maybe 2 generic designs. Hopefully that is something the next game with customizable mechs improves on. I think that's the only real blemish on the presentation of a lot of these endgame cutscenes. Assuming you don't get the glitch where it has the lights on already, the first trip through Volataris is nice and atmospheric and foreboding. If I remember, my initial reaction to seeing the aesthetic and technology around there was that it looked a lot like something out of Agniratha, and I think I got some pushback on my reaction to the ending for that. People are saying that it looked more like Highentia stuff, and yeah, I completely get that. Obviously, there's more stone stuff, and that brings to mind Highentia far more than Mechanis. I guess I just thought the color and patterns of the lights was more reminiscent of stuff from the Central Factory and Agniratha than that, but given the fact that both Elma's people and the Samarians seem to have a kind of space Highentia vibe going for them in their architecture, technology, and outfits, I'm guessing the Highentia similarities other people saw were intentional, while the Mechanis things I saw were coincidence. There are also several Xenoblade 3 sound effects used throughout Volataris, and I don't think you can reasonably say that that indicates some sort of connection between the Samarians and anyone from Xenoblade 3. I think it's just partially reusing sound effects and partially a little Easter egg, because Volataris is a construct designed to exist inside the rift in perpetuity, keeping Void's mind trapped, almost as if it was stuck in some sort of endless now. And Origin probably physically existed within the rift for at least a little bit of time before Ionios was formed, plus it more or less is a miniature artificial collective unconscious, and almost all technology in 3 seems to be derived from the Origin project in some way, so thematically, similar sounds make sense. I think Void's entire spiel before the fight against him in the Vita is the most unintentionally funny thing in the world. Like, he is legitimately just going on about how smart he is. He's the prime intellect of Samar. If he was smarter than all the other Samarians, how did he let them imprison him in the first place? And he's like, no, I'm not wrong. I'm not stupid. I don't understand death because I'm physically incapable of doing it. Not because I'm an idiot who can't empathize with people or understand anything. Of course I'm running. I need to run long enough to preserve my existence so I can understand this thing that you guys have inherent knowledge of. Also, I know how the collective unconscious and you guys in MIMS work, so that makes me smarter than all you idiots. And then much like his foil and possibly nobody, Zed, he just kind of gets rhetorically defeated because he's unwilling to admit that he does not understand or is incapable of understanding something. Except the funny thing with this game is that unlike in 3, where it's just kind of implicit, I think this is the one point where Al directly looking into the camera and explaining the themes works, because it's extremely funny to walk up to the most Reddit Xeno villain of all time, point at his stupid face, and be like, yeah, you're too dumb to realize that you don't know this, so you lose, I'm smarter than you. And again, I just wish the canonical Redditors in the cast could have been there to join in the dog pile. While I have been mostly talking about his comparisons with Zed for thematic reasons, and of course his backstory is just Space Klaus, I do think Void, especially in his final boss form, is intended to be a combination of every single numbered Xenoblade main antagonist. From Xenoblade 1, he has Klaus's backstory, and the backdrop to the final battle does seem like it could fit in with Zanza's final battle backgrounds. From Future Connected, well, he's from a different world, just like the Fog King was, and there's some Black Fog looking stuff around the final battle arena and Volataris as a whole, which I will talk about in a minute. From base game Xenoblade 2, he's absorbed the Ares, which is a super robot powered by the Conduit, much like Ion was. We'll talk about another parallel with that later. And I think the appearance, the tentacles, and the blue color of his final boss form are intended to be reminiscent of a Malthus in his transformed state. For base game 3, I don't need to tell you about any more parallels with Zed, you know them already. And from Future Redeemed, like Alpha, he's trying to escape to a new world. But this game actually goes a step further, and if you miss the DPS check or don't do the bind command in the final battle, he actually will escape and just dip from the arena mid-fight, giving you a non-standard game over, which I think is really cool. Also, Vita Void, using the Ares cores, which look like Ouroboros cores, absorbs the Ares and transforms into something that is much bigger and more powerful, and has a jelly-like texture. Yeah, I am pretty sure the process he used to absorb Al and the Ares is whatever his version of interlinking is. The final boss really is just, what if Zed Klaus was in control of whatever kind of Ouroboros thing formed if 2 ions interlinked with each other? The only wrinkle here is that Al directly says that he and Void's minds melded while they were in the rift, and not when he was absorbed. So I'm kinda guessing they did some sort of pseudo-interlink thing while they were there too, and that facilitated Void being able to absorb him as easily here. Also, Al is somewhat interlinked with the Ares itself because he serves as its power source, so I think we do kind of have several different levels of not quite but pretty much Ouroboros going on here. As for the Volataris exploration itself, I honestly think I might be one of the most positive on it out of anyone, especially people who have as negative opinions on the epilogue overall as me. Yeah, it does kind of have to take the spot of worst Xenoblade X area by default because it's so much smaller than the continents of Mira, and there's no side content associated with it, but I wouldn't really call it bad. I genuinely enjoyed getting to explore a new area in a Xenoblade X game in 2025, and the fact that it was pretty well built around flying skells, better than I think any area in the main game was a actual bonus. I kind of want to see an X-style game where you do get flight a little bit earlier on, and maybe just have some zones where you're restricted on where you're able to fly, so you can still have large set pieces that are only explorable on foot. All things considered, Act 3 does feel like the least disjointed and most internally consistent part of the entire epilogue, so I honestly feel like, at least after the part where the White Whale 2 starts taking off, all of that is just the end of the original planned Extended X story with very little changes made over the years. Volataris feels like X is getting the final dungeon it always deserved, which really it didn't have. Chapter 11 had a little bit of a dungeon, but the approach to the Lifehold Core is just flying to the Lifehold Core, and there literally is no final dungeon before you're dropped in the final boss gauntlet, which thankfully we do get to have here. I may have been giving it the benefit of the doubt in that I would usually fly to an island, then get out of my Skell, then explore the entire island on foot, and that would definitely be a completely different gameplay experience as someone who literally just stuck in their Skell the entire time and flew around everywhere unless they absolutely needed to get out to grab a party member or spear or something, but I don't know, it's fine. Lack of Frontier Nav is whatever, the spears serve as landmarks and you could put down pins in this version of the game, and I genuinely think the lack of minimap is good. I think the Xenoblade X game should force people to explore in the Xenoblade X game if they want to complete the Xenoblade X game. If you say you like Xenoblade X DE, but you complained about having to do story mission requirements, and you think Volataris is a really bad and annoying area, no, you do not like Xenoblade X. You are just invested enough in the story for it to gaslight you into thinking you did like Xenoblade X, because you clearly hate the exploration, the main point of the video game, and the thing almost every major fan of it will point out as the best thing if you ask them. I think the 4-slot weapons you can get from finding certain party members are really cool and an actually unique and interesting addition to endgame gameplay, as they can genuinely improve the stats on a support weapon you're not using for attacking far more than you could ever do in the original game. This and what Howling Soul does for Sniper Rifle are, I think, the two gameplay changes in DE that genuinely increase build variety, because unfortunately, almost everything else just makes an already broken weapon or strategy even stronger. I'm also a big fan of how the party members were actually distributed throughout Volataris. It seems like they did their best for environmental storytelling and put characters where it would make the most sense for them to be given their personality. The Clurians are together on an island that has a spear, because of course Neil now wanted to check that out. Mia is as out of the way and deep in a cave as you could possibly get, which is par for the course for Mia. L somehow ended up back on the ship, because of course he did, and both Murderous and HB are located pretty high up so they could look down on everybody. I've tried to find a naming scheme for the areas in Volataris, and I think I've been able to find one. Slightly corrupted versions of names of stars and constellations. This appears to be an expansion on the fact that in the real world, Mira is the name of the star Omicron Ceti, which is notable for being the example of a specific class of variable stars. The canon reason for the name is that Maurice named the planet after a woman named Mira Torres who died on Earth and he respected a lot, but out of universe, it definitely was named after the star, as Mira also appears as the name of a specific location in the Baten Kaitos series, and all major locations in that series are named after various stars, including the name Baten Kaitos itself. The names that are definitely a reference to something specific are Boötis Reef, which is a reference to the constellation Boötes, or the herdsman, Lebra Fault Zone, which is pretty obviously Libra, Ocus Corridor probably comes from the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, but it was also the birth name of King Artaxerxes III of the Achaemenid Empire, so there might be a smaller sub-theme of ancient rulers as well, because one of the new tyrants is named Hammurabi. Back to things I'm more certain about, Ravaged Vargo is Virgo, Sacred Perses is Perseus, Altar's branch is Altair, the brightest star in the constellation Aquila, the eagle, and Arcturus's axle is Arcturus, the fourth brightest star in the sky, and perhaps more relevantly, the brightest in the constellation of Boötes itself. And that's not the only name that references a star in a constellation we've already talked about, as Kebrai's fork is probably from Kebalrai, which is Beta Ophiuchi, the fifth brightest star in the constellation of Ophiuchus. This continues with Pika's drop, which is probably a reference to Spica, the brightest star in Virgo. And keeps going with Shabik's branch, which is probably a reference to Sabik, also known as Eta Ophiuchi, another star in the constellation Ophiuchus, and one very familiar to Final Fantasy XIV fans, given the accolades of its heart and its known love of tacos. The 5 names I couldn't figure out the reference behind are Forbidden Quala, Garius Airspace, Sierra Corpus, Lague's Suspension Bridge, and Yurgis's Nostrils. So if anyone is able to figure out what star, constellation, or other celestial body they're referencing, do let me know in the comments. Also, let's not spread the misinformation that the structure in the middle of Volataris is called the Rose Garden. It's very clearly labeled Tower of Eternity in the game itself, and the term Rose Garden is not used anywhere in XDE. The tower looks a bit like concept art for something called the Rose Garden from the original art book, but I was only using that name for it as a placeholder for its actual name when that got revealed in the final game, which may or may not have been Rose Garden, and obviously it isn't, so let's not start peddling that, oh, I'm calling it this thing and that means something. I have a feeling that if the original Rose Garden design and that name do show up in the future, it will be more associated with the entities who made Mira, and not either Void or whatever this branch of the Samarians is, just because the name and the fact that the concept art depicted it as a space station or ship orbiting the planet suggests to me some connection with the idea of cultivating it. I have almost nothing to say about the little lore cutscenes that come from unlocking each of the spears. It sure is just little bits and pieces of what Al directly tells us later, so they're mostly redundant. I only really have anything to say about the Trinity Galders because they're the only enemies in the entirety of Volataris that don't have the special Volataris texture and lighting on top of their regular enemy model, and they are the 3 colors of the main series Trinity processor. I don't think this has any canon implications. I'm pretty sure it was just an Easter egg because it would make no sense for any of this stuff to be connected to the Trinity processor from the main series at all. Maybe the Samarians did create a similar device, but at the same time, that's already basically what the Ares cores are, so I'm pretty sure it's just a neat shout out. This is also probably the best place left to give a shout out to the new music. While I do think it's unfortunate that we only get the one brand new Sawano track and his other 2 contributions are new covers of existing songs, all 3 of those are good, and also, all of the contributions made by Misaki Umase are also great as well. Her tracks are noticeably not by Sawano, but they do still capture the tone and vibe of a Xenoblade X song, and I think they're all good compositionally as well. If anything, they do sound a little bit closer to the style of a numbered Xenoblade game than Sawano's tracks from the original. I know when people heard a little bit of the Volataris battle theme in that one trailer, they thought it might have been one of the composers from the numbered games trying to emulate Sawano's style instead of a disciple of Sawano, most likely being directed to sound a little bit closer to the numbered games. But either way, Sawano is going to be just as, if not more expensive when they're making the next X game as he was when they're making XDE, but I think I'd be happy to have Umase back even if she was handed the majority of a full game's OST. Also, if they are just directly making X2 and Xenoblade 4 the same game, it might just outright make more sense to use her style for any X-related things, because it does skew a little bit closer to what the other composers are doing. Now it's time for the Great Volataris Black Fog Extravaganza, because why is it there, and is it the same kind of stuff as in Xenoblade 3? Well, we do know that the future connected Black Fog and the Xenoblade 3 Black Fog are the same thing, and the Fog Beasts and Fog King are connected to that, which is just a harbinger of the worlds of Xenoblade 1 and 2 coming together and impending annihilation events. I think that if the Black Fog in Volataris was supposed to be the exact same kind of thing as the Xenoblade 3 Black Fog, it would be connected to the ghosts and not Void, who is also against the ghosts. I could easily be disproven in a later game, but I'm pretty sure currently that the Fog Beasts and Fog King and the ghosts are 2 completely separate kinds of thing that work very similar to Gnosis. And I think that based on what we've seen, it's much more likely that the ghosts will eventually be given the exact same full explanation than Gnosis were, while the Fog Beasts are just kind of creatures from another world that's getting close to the one you're in, bleeding over across the rift. If you make the pretty reasonable assumption that the rift is involved in that kind of thing happening, I do think it makes sense for the Fog Beasts to manifest in a similar way to Ghosts or Gnosis, but they're not the exact same kind of thing. Like, the Fog King is a Guldo from the world of Xenoblade 2, manifesting in the world of Xenoblade 1 prior to the intersection. It is not the universe's corrective system like the Ghosts are. What does this mean for the Volataris Fog, though? Well, I don't think it's the same thing, because there's nothing to indicate annihilation events would occur given any of the multiverse stuff in XDE, but I think it is still some kind of artifacting phenomena that occurs when something from one universe ends up in another universe. Remember, up until after the final battle, even though we're inside Volataris, all of Act 3 takes place within Mira's universe. And Volataris itself was created in the Samarians universe, which, unless Goetti's wild theorizing about Mira containing the Samar Federation homeworld was true, is not Mira's universe. So there is still stuff getting dragged into a world that it did not originate in, and I could see black fog manifesting because of that. Void's battle arena has the highest concentration of the fog, which makes sense. It's where he is actively trying to flee to another universe from, and it makes sense that there's a lot of fog before the White Whale 2 even gets there, as Volataris is already populated by a bunch of ganglion enemies from both Mira and ones that probably originated from Earth's universe as well, so there's a lot of stuff just that did not originally come from the Samarian universe with Volataris in there to begin with. Elma doesn't mention it, so there's nothing in the game backing it up, but I would not be surprised if, when a universe that the ganglion are in is about to get destroyed, Void called Volataris out of the rift, had everyone in their ganglion ships go inside it, and then use that as a big transport to get to whatever new universe they were going to. 3 and XDE are the only Xenoblade games that have to do with multiple universes, and they're also the only Xenoblade games with Black Fog and with something that looks like the Ares/Ouroboros. So even if we can't see a direct connection here, I think at the very least, all of those visual motifs are something in parallel and might just be new iconography for the series to indicate that something with multiple worlds or something drawing power from the collective unconscious is going on. This line of thought does kind of fall apart when you wonder why there isn't any black fog around the White Whale or really any other ship, person, or object that didn't originate there. But first off, the whale seems to have been in space for a while before it crashed on Mira. Maybe the black fog outgassed out there or something like that. And then secondly, it seems like basically everything on Mira came from a different universe originally. And there's also the Oblivia Canyon, which does seem to have black fog in it. So maybe the planet was intentionally designed to store all the fog somewhere because everything there is creating it. I don't know. Moving on to the first phase of the final boss battle, I have mixed opinions on this. I've absolutely softened on it a bit since I first went through it, where I ended up stuck for like 2 hours because I got skill checked and didn't have a great build, which I then refused to alter at all, and despite having like 26 million credits, kept bashing my head against the wall using a Hresvelg instead of buying a level 50 Skell and just buying a weapons to put on it. So yeah, that's an issue, but I also think it's not the best designed fight in the game. Like, obviously, a Gossera cannon from an Ares 90 is going to one-shot this no matter what happens. So I'm not talking about the fact that you could easily outscale it, especially in DE with the upgraded level cap, but I still have a few issues even when you're approaching it on an even keel. Yes, this is one of the more complex bosses in the entire Xenoblade series, and I do think overall that's a good thing. I absolutely want bosses to have more unique mechanics other than hits hard or uses certain element or uses certain status. But at the same time, Monolith is still learning the ropes when it comes to stuff like that, so things aren't really communicated that well. He summons a set of 4 adds a couple times throughout the fight, and that's completely normal for a Xenoblade final boss. But one of them has an enrage attack that just completely wipes the party in one hit if you don't kill it fast enough. And there is zero indicator that it's even charging up something like that anywhere, which is a little ridiculous because there's an on-screen text indicator and a UI indicator letting you know that Void's about to use the cores to try and escape. So I feel like if he summons 4 much smaller enemies that are so spaced out and so high up, I didn't even realize he summons all 4 every single time until my winning attempt, there should absolutely be an indicator that one of them is charging up something that will one-shot you, no ifs, ands, or buts, especially because there isn't a way to cancel the cast like you can with Void himself, and you are just left with a DPS check. I think the idea of canceling an enrage cast on Void is really cool, although I might have been stupid and just let him escape the first time because I wasn't able to tell what I was supposed to do. I thought they were just reusing part of the bind icon and you weren't literally supposed to bind him. But 1, the hitbox for actually hitting the bind is weird and finicky, so you might just miss out on it if you're saving it for the last second to get more damage in while he's not actually trying to attack you or anything. And 2, what is the obsession with this fight and making you get in your Skell if you're on foot? It's like they wanted to try and nerf all of the best on foot strategies just by making sure you had to get in your Skell and cancel your on foot overdrive at least a couple times during the fight. You need to get in the Skell to bind him to prevent him from escaping, and it's almost impossible to hit some of the adds from the ground, so you also need to get in your Skell to fly up and take those out, especially the one with the one-shot ability. So it seems like they're trying to make you not rely on the most broken strategies from the original game, even though they also gave you tools to make a lot of them even more broken than they already were. The spears being an optional way to make the final battle easier for you are really cool, But the way they make the fight easier is by being appendages that you can break. So guess what? If you want to actually engage with this cool mechanic, you better not be running Core Crusher. And then they also made the mistake of allowing you to target all of the spears at once instead of them breaking in successive order, because I was in call for someone beating this fight for the first time. They intentionally nerfed the entire party to try and get the proper experience from the fight and make it more cinematic and stuff, because they did have an Ares 90 at that point, and then used the scale art that inflicts damage on all appendages, and Void instantly exploded because they all popped at once. So good job on that too. They tried a lot of cool things, but then they're just bafflingly weird decisions everywhere else in the fight, and I really hope they get better at this by the time of the next game. That, I think, is it for the negatives for the rest of this video, though. It's time to just talk about peak cool super robot stuff. The first thing I need to point out during the cutscene in between phases of the fight is that when the Ares comes back, the cores pop out of Void, fuse together into one orb, and then the Ares comes out of some sort of fog rift looking thing, grabbing the orb, which puts the cores back in their usual places on its body. I'm gonna be honest, I don't quite know what that means, and why the Ares didn't just pop out of Void. Yeah, I'm willing to believe that he is able to maintain this form on his own now that he already had a taste of the core's power and had absorbed the Ares for a bit, but he did physically absorb the Ares. So I don't know why when it comes back, it doesn't come back out of him like the cores did. But maybe that's some special function of the cool robot that we'll find out in a later game. Void mauling so hard about his own ignorance that he starts turning red is pretty funny, and again reminiscent of Zed's breakdown near the end of his fight. And the fact that he has tentacles that look like that and have bright red spots on them makes me think like an octopus or a jellyfish or some bioluminescent sea creature for some reason, which I don't think was intentional because the tentacles are supposed to be calling back to Amalthus, which are supposed to be calling back to the Guldos, which don't really have anything to do with sea creatures besides having tentacles, so I don't know what's going on with that. I can't believe I'm going to have to walk through this next part in excruciating detail, but I do in fact have to explain to some people that Cross being able to pilot the Ares is not a contradiction. First off, Al directly says, "It's alright, I am with you," when he puts them in the pilot seat, indicating that maybe just him sitting or standing next to them, like he does for the entire rest of the cutscene, and presumably is also doing during the battle, is enough for it to work for someone else. There's also the very established fact that he is a core component to the Ares running now, which means he might have some sort of say over the rules and is able to bend them in a situation like this. And then also, in his final heart-to-heart, Al says that he can't exactly figure out why the Ares requires a warm body, but says it might just be its preference. And he's the guy who personifies his mech so much, he doesn't refer to it as the Ares like anyone else, he just refers to it as Ares, like it's another person and that's its proper name. He's probably not wrong to do this. Ares, while it might not literally be alive, does seem to have intelligence to some degree, and even if Elma doesn't personify it to the same extent Al does, she does seem to think that it was the one to guide her to Earth, so if it has preferences, then it probably is willing to bend the preferences to allow someone who is not in a physical body to pilot it for a little bit, when the options are that or everyone dies. It was just assimilated into Void and probably is not very happy with him right now, and Al is just straight up not in the shape to fight. He does not fight at all once he's recovered. Like, Cross is the one piloting Ares during the final battle, then they swap to their original scale, and Al flies back, but he doesn't do any of the fighting, and then he's just sitting there in the White Whale too, hoping everyone else can hold out for long enough during the entire rest of the cutscene. So it really seems like he's not fully recovered at all until probably the very ending. Also, in the Affinity mission that is 100% required to get to Act 3 in the first place, Al directly says love is even more important than a physical body to be able to pilot Ares, so, you know, there you go. Anyway, in addition to Ares very obviously being an equivalent to the big Ouroboros from Future Redeemed, the cockpit also makes a very explicit callback to Ion from Xenoblade 2, as this shot of the cores in the cockpit's holographic display is very similar to this shot of a similar display in Ion's cockpit when Numa uses it at the end of 2. The big difference here is that Ares has 6 orbs of the same size and color, and Ion has only 5, but the place that's taken up by the middle orb on the Ares display is instead a representation of the Trinity processor itself on Ion. It seems to indicate which cores are currently interfacing with Ion's systems and powering it up, as there are 2 full slots and 1 empty slot. Empty slot is obviously Ontos, and we hear Malos talk to Numa a little bit later on in this very scene, so it's likely that there are some residuals of him in there even though he fell out of it and his physical body disintegrated. Also, if it turns out Ion just works more like Ares than we thought, maybe the whole soul tethering thing Ares can do is why Malos is still around in Xenoblade 3 in the first place. That makes sense to me. Either way though, this just adds more fuel to the fire to indicate that they seem to be putting Ion plus the entire Trinity processor, which is something we never see at any point in the series, on the same level as Ares Prime as depicted in XDE, which is kinda nuts, and is going to make X-related stuff very relevant way further on in the future, especially if the enemies only keep getting stronger from here. I've talked at length about Ares drawing souls from the Abyss and all that stuff, and the specific people that are stored there, so I can kinda skip over this part of the scene. Everyone is depicted as a golden light mote, which makes sense given what we know about Xenoblade 3 and how Lao was depicted before. Everyone's coming from the same place Lao went, so it makes sense they're all the same golden motes he was swallowed up by. And the phrase vessel for all sentient life indicates that maybe it is possible to use Ares to pull someone's soul out of the Abyss and put it in a body that's waiting for them, so it might not all be lost for the people who are supposed to have been stored in the Lifehold core, especially if their genetic data is still present. Body and soul are pretty explicitly 2 separate things in this continuity now, and they have a quick route for one of them and might just straight up still have data to recreate the other. Given all the comparisons I've already made between Ares and Ouroboros, capped off by the true combo of Al directly saying the words "hit it," the new Kiwi Lost starting to play, and then Ares just doing the exact Future Redeemed Ouroboros pose, I think it might be safe to say that the purple bits of the Ares Prime frame, which seems to be the original Samarian construction and all the silver stuff was added by Elma's people, is made up of whatever the Samarian version of Origin metal was, because not only does it work the same, it actually does look a lot like the outside of Origin. Absolutely zero of my complaints about Phase 1 of Void apply to Phase 2, by the way. I love cool super robot stuff, as you can probably tell, and this is a very good, very effective victory lap fight. Plus, Wir Fliegen does not overwrite the battle theme in either phase, which is very welcome and carried over mostly from Xenoblade 3. It would still be absolutely lovely to have a toggle though, because Wir Fliegen is even worse than Xenoblade 3's chain attack theme. Most post-game fights are done in overdrive for the entirety of the battle, so Wir Fliegen is literally the only song you're going to hear more than a small snippet of for your entire post-game. And I started getting so tired of it after a while that, besides affinity missions, I've straight up had my Switch muted for most of the post-game now, because even hearing Wir Fliegen in the background behind whatever YouTube video or stream I'm listening to would still be annoying to me. Another cool overdrive related thing about this final battle is that the Ares overdrive mode makes complete sense now. It's called Legion, because Ares Prime is powered by all sentient life. We are Legion, and we won't let our progress be stopped by someone like Void. The 70 and 90 do also have Legion as their overdrive mode, but they were adapted from the Prime, so it makes sense. And given the amount of stuff in the epilogue that was very clearly telegraphed by stuff in the main game, I think they already knew that the Prime was going to work this way back in 2015 as well, so this isn't a retcon either. Void's death is extremely hilarious. The villain getting killed and immediately thinking, hey wait, why was I running from death so long? This shit's great. And then Al just being, hey idiot, we don't like dying either because it only happens once. See ya, is just stupid enough to be hilarious to me. Curiously, Void dissolves into blue motes and not golden ones. If gold is the color of leaving the system, and red is the color of getting your life harvested for the flame clock, blue is the catch-all color for everything else. I think there are 2 possibilities for what was specifically meant in this case though. While Mobius who are killed in their transformed state give off red motes, ones who are killed in their humanoid state do give off the blue, and there are a lot of things that are similar between Void and Mobius. Namely, the fact that he was literally trapped in his own Endless Now, so it is very possible that there's some connection there beyond what I've already discussed. And then also, blue motes are the color of off-seeing. Red motes turn blue when an off-seeing occurs, and if you off-see without anything dead near you, you will still make blue motes. The art book for Xenoblade 3 confirms that blue is the color of the feelings of those who are still alive. Gold is ascension and escaping from Mobius's reach. while blue is you being tinged by the emotions of the person seeing you off, even if you are still within the system. Does this mean that Void might come back again? Maybe, but Yorin's mud puppets, who are only made from people's memories, also give off blue motes. So it's possible that with all the decay his intellect and sanity had over the time he was trapped in Volataris, he actually did cease to be alive by some definition of the term. There's a good chance there was so little of his soul left that he did more or less cease to exist here because there wasn't really anything even to go to the collective unconscious. Or maybe there's some sort of weird hell outside the collective, or he didn't join the collective and we'll see some weird version of him in the future. I don't know. I think Void's probably gone for good. I don't think you can tell an interesting story with him in it. He's not the most interesting character already, and they really did mine the best they could out of him just within this epilogue. But the rest of the Samarians are probably going to be relevant. After the battle, the first thing that happens is Ryan Xenoblade hype moments and aura, and I think it's very interesting that we see Cross be some sort of Skell pilot prodigy, being able to pull off things that took Al the Ares with just their generic regular Skell, and then they also survive. That not only suggests to me that there might be an X2 with an avatar system where you are playing the same character from the original game, but also that Cross's origins will be explained. I've always been a fan of the Avatar of Mira theory, and nothing in this game gets in the way of that. Plus, it might make losing Mira sting a little bit less badly if they do recover their memories in the next game, and it turns out the real Mira was literally ourselves and the party members we met along the way. My other theory is that Cross is Udu. Not literally Udu from Xenosaga, but a wave existence from the upper domain, using the Mimeosome as a way of interfacing with the lower domain without causing major problems. And I think our amnesiac self-insert character secretly having been God all along is a very interesting potential twist, and they could even go meta with it by making the upper domain the real world, the power of the conduit the literal electricity we provide to our systems to play the Xeno games on, and then wave existences would be humans, and Cross would be us in a literal sense because we are the Udu powering that Mim. This wouldn't even be Monolith's first time doing something like that. A core element of Baten Kaitos is that you, the player, are a character in-game as a guardian spirit for the protagonist, and it's actually a mechanic that characters will ask you questions, and your answers to that will determine how things go. Either way though, this scene shows that Cross is actually superior to Al as a hero. Not only can they replicate his moves just on sight, but they can do it without using an Ares, and they attempt to do the exact same sacrifice he did in the battle over Mira, but are able to actually make it back and still be with everyone as soon as they make it to this new world. That's not to say that Al somehow repairing broken circuits and juicing up the power of the warp drive just with love isn't extremely cool, and when Ares locks in, there is a big golden field that emanates from the jump drive and covers the entire battlefield. Maybe that is a Hilbert effect field, and is part of why Cross was able to fight off the ghost so effectively, but either way, the real hero of humanity, the hero of all people of Mira, is us. That's the real reason Al chose us and not, say, Elma to pilot Ares in the final battle against Void. We're the one who grew to love Mira the most. We, the player, love Mira more than any of these fictional characters ever possibly could. And it's that love for all the peoples of Mira, all the creatures, all the places, all things that Al could not have possibly gotten to know as well as we did, that gives us the strength to defeat Void, to avenge the inevitable destruction of Mira, and bring its people and its ideals to a new world where we can make an even greater one. The first few shots of the rift are extremely interesting because the very first one is dark red and dark blue, seeming like they're about to clash into each other, and that is the exact same imagery used for the Xenoblade 1 and 2 worlds being about to collide in Xenoblade 3. It then changes color to a purple color, one very reminiscent of that used for Ionios, and somewhat similar to the background of the final cutscene where Zed is defeated. I don't know if this is just similar iconography used for the concept of different universes in the Rift and all that, or if for whatever given value of a relative timescale, Ionios takes place while the White Whale 2 is traveling through the Rift in search of a new world, and we're actually seeing the intersection almost occurring, and then the post-credit scene of Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed. Now we arrive at Void's backstory. I've already said a lot about this, but there's going to be even more. In the first CG, we can see that not only does the baby Void, but also the two adult Samarians kneeling in front of him have horns. This of course tracks with Elma's true form, but lends even more credence to the theory that El is also a Samarian descendant. And honestly, if El's people made their way to Mira a very long time before anyone else did, and were just stuck there isolated from the rest of the multiverse for who knows how long, eventually resulting in El being the last of his kind, he might actually be the closest related to the original Samarians out of anyone on the Whale. Barring color, the conduit here is identical to that from Xenoblade 2, in shape and in detail, that is, it has none, which is very different from the Xenosaga Zohar, which has a noticeably different shape and obviously a lot of features on it. This is only interesting because the Zohar-shaped Lifehold database units are shaped way more like the Zohar than the conduit, which, okay, yeah, fair enough. It's not like they knew exactly what the conduit was going to look like when they made X anyway. And the shape 100% is an Easter egg, because even if the conduit was always supposed to appear in this exact form, nobody on X's Earth had any idea it was even a thing, so that shape is 100% just an Easter egg. Now, why the Trinity cores are shaped more like the Saga Zohar than the conduit, I have no idea. That's not a bit or me being coy or anything. Even including Saga as canon, I can't think of a good explanation for that. The next CG shows off the Ares in its original Samarian armor, which is very different from Elma's race's armor that it wears in the game itself. I think this is a cool design. I couldn't tell you if we're ever going to see it again, but it's neat looking. The real reason I'm stopping on this section, though, is because of a Saga parallel that I've neglected to mention this entire time. The specific thing that attracted the ghosts to the Samarian homeworld was Void using the conduit to create the Ares and its cores. The ghosts are attracted to the conduit and the cores that mimic its power. This too is exactly how Gnosis work. They're attracted to the wavelengths of both the Zohar and the emulators. The entire first story section of Xenosaga 1 is a fleet of ships recovering one of the emulators and then getting destroyed by Gnosis that are attracted to the emulator and start attacking. The ghosts even attacked X's Earth, which never had a conduit, only the Ares cores, so they are attracted to replicated conduit energy and not just the real deal, which does put them exactly one-to-one with Gnosis on this front. The other question you might be asking is Void's conduit the same conduit as Klaus's? It seems like the flow of time between different universes is completely messed up anyway, and we don't know where Klaus's conduit goes after Xenoblade 2. Well, I don't know, but also the answer is probably something along the lines of yes and no, and also it doesn't matter at all. The conduit is simply a connection point where a higher dimension filled with energy touches a universe in this lower dimension. As such, even though it can be interacted with and moved around, the conduit isn't really a physical entity at all. It's just a representation of that condensed higher dimensional power leaking down into the lower one. A quote-unquote second conduit would just be the domains interacting in a different place, so that it appears in a different physical location, and that disturbance can also be moved around and interacted with separately of the other one. Void's conduit is just the upper domain intersecting with the lower domain in a different location that just ended up being in a different universe. It seems like the multiverse is infinite, and there probably are infinite conduits, but there also is just one conduit. That's just the nature of the fundamentally higher dimensional existence the conduit is. If I were to guess though, I would say that Void's conduit is not the same manifestation as Klaus's. While yes, relative time between universes seems to be very screwy, it does seem like Void was in the Rift for an extremely long time. And based on how the conduit's discovery is described exactly the same way as the Xenosaga Zohar's discovery, it's very likely Klaus's conduit existed within that universe since the Big Bang, but was only ever first discovered on Earth. This means that it was just sitting there somewhere in Klaus's universe for 13 billion years before anyone started to do anything with it, so that's an extremely long time for the Samarians to not have their hands on it. And while Void has been in there for a while, I don't know if he was there for the entire history of Klaus's universe. Also, while it being purple does not mean anything specifically, if you ask me to indicate that a conduit was not the same one as the one from the numbered games without using any words, I'd probably make it a different color. I absolutely don't think the color has anything to do with Malos coming back either. Whoa, hey, Void looks like Zed. I wonder if anyone made a video on that already. Al speculates that the reason Void got released from his imprisonment is just because it deteriorated over time, but we do see a shaft of light illuminating his face, which heavily suggests to me that it was the other thing he thought, a ripple from another world. And I don't think they'd include this at all if it wasn't something from another Xenoblade game. As to which thing from the numbered games it is, who knows? The most obvious thing is just Klaus's experiment, but it could be the conduit leaving at the end of Xenoblade 2. Ionios forming in the first place. Remember, Origin probably was in the Rift at some point in time, and Zed had to steal Void's appearance somehow. It could be Origin reacting at the end of Xenoblade 3, or it could even be the worlds coming together at the end of that game. And we don't know, maybe it will be explained, maybe it won't be. I think this can be left completely ambiguous without it getting in the way of anything. I will say though, I'm very glad the Epilogue story didn't lean really hard on the other games to have a plot in the first place. Like, the conflict is an extension of the conflict of the original Xenoblade X. The stakes are an escalation of those from the base game. There are no characters from other Xenoblade games that show up at all, and while it's likely that Void getting released, the inciting incident of all of the plot, was caused by something from another game, the characters from X resolve this problem on their own, including defeating Void, who might be the most powerful Xenoblade antagonist so far, without any help or knowledge from anyone from another game. Think about how many times I've had to bring up Xenosaga lore so far in this video, and how few times I actually mentioned another Xenoblade game besides a parallel. With the exception of it being called the Conduit and not the Zohar, all the new lore was either from Saga, not another Blade game, or a Xenoblade X original. Yeah, it does just dump a lot of stuff from Saga on you, but ultimately, Al and the Rift, Void getting released, and the ending are the only things that can really be considered overt fan service for numbered game fans. X still was X, and it still was its own unique thing from the first to the last. If I'm being honest, I spent way longer looking at the CG of the 3 planets getting destroyed than I needed to, because it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. We're not getting any additional lore out of this besides what Al is verbally telling us about Elma's world having been in a different universe from Earth, but I do believe the order in which the planets are depicted in this CG is opposite from the order Al describes them. He just says them in the order they were destroyed, but I believe the first planet shown off is Mira, and the last one is Elma's world. The middle one is definitely Earth. That is extremely easy. We know what Earth looks like in the real world. It's the only one of the 3 that only has 1 moon. And it's pretty clear that the ocean in the middle of the planet is the Western Indian Ocean, as the Arabian Peninsula and east coast of Africa is clearly visible amidst the destruction. The third planet is the one with the smallest chunk taken out of it, so we can actually see more of its surface than the other 2. And the geography just straight up does not match with Mira at all. There are a lot of smaller land masses than Mira has, and there's only really 1 major continent visible. On top of that, some of the night side of the planet is visible, and we can very clearly see a lot of lights from cities, which is something Earth would have, but we could clearly tell the second planet was Earth, and Mira 100% wouldn't, so by process of elimination, this has to be Elma's world. That then means the first planet shown off has to be Mira. This somewhat tracks. There's no lights, no recognizable geography. It has the most moons out of all the 3 planets shown off. 2 of Mira's are missing, but so is 2/3 of the planet, so maybe they were destroyed already when this picture was taken. But I am genuinely pretty sad that this doesn't actually look like Mira at all. There are no landmarks from the game itself in it. I feel like maybe if someone's able to map the 5 continents to a globe like in the holographic display in Blade Tower from earlier in the epilogue, and then we're able to figure out what landform in the game this green area with either a little lake or a rocky thing is supposed to be, maybe we'd be able to figure out what it depicts, but I don't know. I'm really guessing the artist just was not given a reference of Mira to work off with, and that's a little lame. As for Al discovering the path to heaven, well, there are actually a few things that can be talked about here. There are good arguments for both the Rift being the imaginary number domain and the entire upper domain, but this is the scene that solidifies it for me that it is supposed to be the imaginary. The upper domain is frequently equivalated to heaven. Even the unnamed version of it in Xenogears is. But Al describes the Rift as a path to heaven, not heaven itself. And if they're able to get to heaven, but also to just another regular material universe through it, it probably isn't the upper domain. As funny as it would be for it to be Mithrakid, the girl Al sees is 100% just his sister. Her design was absolutely made to harken back to Nephilim from Saga, who harkens back to a younger Ellie from Gears, And Nephilim is heavily associated with the imaginary domain in UMN, but as cool as it would be to imagine her welcoming this new cast of characters to the Xenosaga universe, I don't think Al would have been tearing up if that was just some random girl and not his sister, so it is not the case. This entire sequence is very, very reminiscent of the end of Xenosaga 3, and I can't really say anything else about that here, but Nephilim doesn't do anything like this there, and she isn't wearing the white dress at that point in time anyway, so I really can't think of a way it could be her. While the golden light and white feathers obviously make you think High Entia and the iconography surrounding Future Connected, I also don't know how High Entia or Future Connected could be involved other than the Fog King maybe being a ghost. But I do think this is another intentional saga reference and not just generic angelic imagery to go with the heaven stuff. Will I be explaining this reference? No. It's a reference to Chaos. That's the guy from Xenosaga whose design they reused when they made Alvis. As you might be able to guess by that, I cannot say anything about this guy without spoiling the entire Xenosaga series. But basically, it makes sense that there would be a Chaos reference next to a Nephilim reference, and he is frequently depicted either with wings or with white feathers and other angelic imagery, so it does track, and if you know, you definitely know. I don't really have another place to put it, so I'm just going to talk about it now. I've seen people bring up the idea that Al and Elma might be an Adam and Eve parallel, as they are the only Samarian descendants who have physical bodies. I mean, it is possible, but I've mentioned several times before, it might be possible to get all the Mimiosome humans back into natural bodies eventually. And while yes, their names do begin with A and E, and that lines up with their genders, they're like the most divorced characters could possibly be without me really reading their relationship as purely romantic in the first place. So while it's possible that they might be repopulating humanity, I am leaning on the side of them not going that direction. Believe it or not, we've made it to the very last shot of the epilogue, and yeah, we're probably going to be here for a while. There's one question that I know people want to hear my take on, but before we get to that, I need to point out that this is the last major Xenogears reference left in XDE. And that is, this shot of the White Whale 2 and the planet is an almost one-to-one remake of this shot from the opening of Gears. Unfortunately, there is no way this can be anything more than just a reference, but it is a very cool one. While I do hope a port or remaster does eventually happen, there's obviously zero way this can literally be the same ship and planet from Gears. And I'm extremely hesitant to say that this ending could be leading into a retelling of Gears for several reasons. In a more superficial sense, the ship in Gears crashes, the White Whale 2 is probably not going to do that. The Gears ship only had flesh and blood humans on it, while the White Whale 2 has Mimiosome humans and a bunch of Xenoform races. And Gears had the Zohar on it, the Whale only has the Conduit emulators in the Ares. More importantly though, I don't know if a spiritual retelling of Xenogears can happen anymore, because it's already happened several times. Almost every aspect of Xenogears' themes, character concepts, and plot has already been recycled in either Xenoblade 2, 3, or the original X. I'm not sure how much more on that front they can even do in future Blade games, and that's another reason why I think there's going to be a lot of Xenosaga stuff going forward, because they have done most of Gears, but in comparison have only really scratched the surface of Saga. Now though, we reach the real question at play. Is this the planet from the end of Future Redeemed, and what does this mean for the future of the series? My answer to the first part of that is maybe. It is 100% possible that the blue light from the ending of Future Redeemed is the White Whale 2, and that this is the same planet. I'm going to say that outright. If you think that is the case, you are 100% valid, and I can say absolutely nothing to disprove that. But it is not 100% confirmed, so I'd like to look at this from all possible angles. I will say that regardless of whether or not this is the same planet, I am almost entirely certain that this is the same universe of the numbered games, because there is literally zero reason to blow up Mira this quickly and skedaddle to a new universe, if all you're going to do is end up in another random universe that's also not going to be explored nearly as much as it should be like Mira was. I'm also going to very explicitly lay it out that the light at the end of Future Redeemed being something from X only became possible with Chapter 13. Based on all available knowledge as of Future Redeemed, it was impossible at that time, which is extremely evident in the fact that all of the Future Redeemed theories about the light being X-related are verifiably false and were back then too, and no one came up with the actual potential way it could be that XDE directly lays out for us. This new information does actually add 2 potential options to what the future Redeemed Light could be. The list is now the White Whale 2, Cosmos, a legally distinct version of Cosmos, the humans from the Numbered Games Project Exodus returning to Earth, something brand new that we don't know anything about yet, or the really funny option, more than one of the above. It is 125% not happening, but I think it would be absolutely hilarious if the canon answer to the light is just, JK lol, it's both X and Saga, here, have the White Whale 2 and Cosmos. And the way they do that is they just replicate that scene where you get introduced to the Elsa crew in Xenosaga 1, and just have Cosmos land on the window of the White Whale 2 and cause everyone in there to freak out. Honestly, I think as far as Cosmos is concerned, that is the best possible outcome for her, because she would be rescued by the people of Xenoblade X, and the humans would absolutely be able to use Mimiosome technology to repair her, which means she would already be undergoing treatment by the time they land on the planet, so the Mim stuff would just be used to completely repair her, and she wouldn't have to deal with getting fixed by Tora, which is probably a net positive. Anyway, there are several things about this new planet. I do not think the rings are as big a deal as people are making them. There have been more drastic changes between depictions of the same event in 2 different games earlier in the series. There's never a timescale given for the ending bit of Future Redeemed, and it does zoom in after it shows the wide shot of the planet, so maybe we just can't see the rings from this angle and they formed later. Granted, the fact that the Future Redeemed and Base Game 3 post-credit scenes are supposed to line up might get in the way of that, but even then, time is weird in Xenoblade 3, and it appears to just be universally weird across the multiverse, so I'm not bothered by that whatsoever. And then lastly, we don't need to come up with any elaborate backstory for the rings in the first place if the planet is Earth. Earth has probably had them in the past, it may have them in the future, planets can just get rings and keep them. It is okay to just say that's what that is. And then there is also the fact that rings are a contradiction when it comes to the light being Cosmos as well. Earth at the end of Xenosaga 3 has rings, and I have never pointed that out in the past. You want to know why? I am just extremely stupid and never realized there were rings. I'm gonna be real with you, I only ever noticed the thinner, brighter part that's going around behind the planet, figured, okay, that is just a shaft of light because the sun is in the background, or maybe a space elevator, and didn't look any closer at it because of the Cosmos part that comes after. I just never noticed the thicker, fainter part of the ring that goes in front of the planet. So, yeah, another point in the category of weirdly X and Saga have less contradictions than either does with the Numbered Games right now, I guess. Is this an indicator that they might be using the X cast in future X games to retell all the Saga concepts? Maybe? I don't know. I can't tell what a ring is, apparently. The funny thing is, this actually makes the Future Redeemed shot the odd one out, as it's the only one of these analogous planet shots in the entire Xeno series to not have rings. The Xenogears one is definitely not Earth and does have a ring. The Xenosaga one definitely is Earth and has a ring. The Future Redeemed one is also definitely Earth, maybe not the same one though, and doesn't have a ring. And the Xenoblade X one might be Earth, does have a ring, and the shot is lined up identically to the one from Gears, but not the ones from Saga or the Numbered Games. It's the fact that they went for the Gears shot and not the other two that are definitely Earth, and the fact that the surface of the planet is way more obscured than it is in Future Redeemed, so we can't see the shape of any of the land masses, which we could in FR, which just definitely were ones from Earth, that makes me think that maybe this isn't the same planet. If those things weren't the case, I would just 100% straight up be saying this is the Future Redeemed planet right here, but the fact that they did that and are being weirdly coy with it makes me think that maybe they're doing that on purpose to make people think and talk about it more, and that this is just going to be another planet in the same universe. If I'm being honest, some of this is just me saying the things that I want to see specifically, not on a story front, but on a gameplay front. I keep saying they're going to make an X2, they're going to make an X2, and I do believe that to be true, but it is still 100% possible they're gonna go the lame route and just fold X characters and concepts into whatever the next arc of the series is going to be. Basically, I don't think the next linear-style Xenoblade game is going to be titled Xenoblade 4 for the purposes of trying to get new people into the series, but they could very reasonably make a Xenoblade X2 that is just titled Xenoblade X2, and that is definitely what I want them to do. There absolutely should be open-world, exploration-first styled Xenoblade games in the future, and I think stemming them off of the original X is still the best way to go about that. There is also the fact that, yeah, I do want the crossover to happen, but I don't want things to move too quickly and sacrifice everything they've been building up just for the purpose of that crossover happening. All they've really done is set up that there might be a crossover, but not actually what the topic of the crossover would be, though Samarians or Ghosts is a very good bet. So I do still want there to be at least one more game on the numbered side and one on the X side before we start mashing all of the action figures together for whatever end. I'm probably coping. Most of my correct predictions about the epilogue were things I said were going to happen in the game after this, that they just completely rushed through for the purpose of getting us to this planet now. So, I don't know. There is a good chance the next game is going to open with both casts having known each other already, and they will barely touch on how that happened in flashbacks, and I would not like that at all. And by the way, they're not getting rid of the Xenoblade name for the next game, no matter what happens. Re-releases of Gears and Saga are the closest to that you're ever going to get. Not only is Nintendo never going to let Monolith change the name of the IP now that it's been popular enough to actually be included in lists of their series and stuff on their website and on the app and that kind of thing, but also, the change from Gears to Saga and Saga to Blade was made out of necessity. And Xenoblade 1 wasn't originally intended as a Xeno game, but it only existed to try and get morale back after the Saga series petered out in the first place, so, you know, same principle there. If after 27 years, you actually keep consistently getting new Xeno project proposals signed off on, you're not gonna change the name, you're not gonna fix what isn't broken. And I also can't really see them changing the overall gameplay structure or design philosophy as drastically as the change from Xenosaga 3 to Xenoblade 1 again. I do expect the next game to fundamentally reinvent what it means to be a Xenoblade battle system to at least as large a degree as going from X to 2, but at the same time, it's always going to be real-time combat with arts, set in a large world that encourages exploration, where design is done from the bottom up, coming up with a concept for the world, figuring out gameplay ideas that would be cool, and sculpting the story and themes around that. Though I definitely think there is some sort of overarching plot they want to do lurking in the background of all this. In addition to the things from the original X that weren't adequately answered, there are two especially big questions this epilogue leaves us with. The first one is, why did the ghosts never attack Klaus's Earth? They had the conduit, they were using it for a pretty long time, and it was also present in Alrest, though admittedly inert for almost that entire time, for thousands of years before it departed. You would think the ghosts would be after it eventually, right? While the explanation could be something as simple as the ghosts were just too busy beefing with Samar up and down the entire multiverse to deal with Klaus screwing up 2 or 3 universes, or the plot of Xenosaga, I think there could still be a bigger explanation for it, and I honestly think it would be kind of neat if the overarching plot ends up being controlled by something from the X side of things and not just more and more baggage from Klaus. We have also yet to see the ghost version of the Testaments from Xenosaga, who are beings that are very close to the Gnosis and directly inspired the Mobius consoles in Xenoblade 3 as well, but are also sentient and capable of commanding them. With current knowledge, I can't really see any remaining Samarians being super antagonistic towards either the numbered game or the X characters, so it's possible they would just be a new faction and not necessarily antagonists at all, so an equivalent to the Testaments that operates on a higher scale to Mobius would make sense as a different potential escalation if they decide to never go down the evil wave existence route, which is always a possibility. I keep talking about the Samarians potentially being an antagonistic parallel to pre-collapse humanity on both Earths, but it's also possible that they're a positive mirror to humanity. They're the civilization that did not misuse the gift of the conduit at all, and it was literally just Void's actions that ruined it for everyone. I used to think they were another faction of humans from Klaus's Earth that got flung into a completely different universe after the experiment, and that's no longer true, but a similar principle might be the case. The Samarians may just be hyper-evolved Earth humans from a third Earth, one that we've never seen before in the Xenoblade series, and if they can come in with all their knowledge, their technology, and their wisdom from their billions and billions of years of being advanced humanities to help these two new humanities rebuild and stave off the destruction that once visited them from misuse of the conduit, that could also be a very interesting way to go. The other big question is, I think, a little bit more straightforward, actually, and that is, aren't the ghosts just going to follow the White Whale 2 into this new universe as well? I keep saying they're going to be built up as a new future antagonist because they were clearly never dealt with at all in XDE, and isn't fleeing to another universe just delaying the inevitable anyway if they're just going to come back? Well, yeah, they're probably going to be back, but I also think the characters from X are going to be smarter than that. We know the ghosts are only really attracted to conduit and conduit-like energy sources, and the only things like that on the whale are the Ares cores, but also that it took 30 years since Elma arrived on Earth for the ghosts to get there following her, and since she came from a completely different universe, that might be the timescale the X characters would have to either find a way to dispel them or just prepare to actually fight them off properly this time. On top of that, you have Al, Elma, and several other luminaries of various alien civilizations, and I think between all of them they're gonna figure out they can just not use the Ares cores at all, and that would drastically cut the odds of the ghosts even noticing them in the first place. It's not like they don't have other hyper-advanced alien civilizations with tons of technology on the White Whale too they can use for an alternative power source that doesn't destroy the universe if it lasts too long. No, I think it's the numbered game cast that's far more likely to accidentally summon the ghosts into this universe. The Trinity processors are the only people who still have memories of Earth. Unless Saga is canon, and Ghosts and Gnosis are the exact same thing, the ghosts have never attacked that Earth. None of the numbered cast even knows the potential dangers of using conduit-like energy. And they still have at least 2 living Trinity processor cores, plus they managed to make their own version of the Rift, and within that, their own version of the Ares. So far, they've done basically everything that XDE has told us is going to piss off the ghosts. It's kind of only a matter of time before they get attacked, so they really better hope that either Cosmos or the cast of Xenoblade X isn't too far behind them, because they're gonna be kinda screwed otherwise. Honestly, XDE doesn't seem to be selling as well as I hoped it would, and I'm seeing a depressingly large amount of people I know are Trilogy fans not even bothering to give it a chance for stupid reasons. So, maybe they should do something like that. Have the X-Cast show up to bail out the characters from the next numbered game, and tell you to play Xenoblade X and Xenoblade X2 if you want to see how these people got so cool. Monolith, if you are watching this for whatever reason, and you only want to listen to one suggestion I have for the future of the series, do whatever you can to make as many people play Xenoblade X as possible. There are 3 numbered Xenoblade games already, and there will certainly be more. But there is only one Xenoblade X, and honestly, nothing else in the medium is quite like it, and XDE has not remotely tempered my desire to get to play another one someday. I know some pretty important people to the series have been saying they wanted to make an X2, as recently as the Xenoblade 3 art book from last year, so please, make it happen. If you can't get Nintendo to sign off on it yet, then just make us fans want it so badly they'll have to give it the green light. I know I'll be waiting, and I'm not going to be the only one. For the rest of you though, until next time, this has been Luxon, signing off.